Hey guys, tonight we drift to a sleepy corner of France where the roads are dusty, the cows are too nosy, and your feet hurt before breakfast. You're carrying a leather mailbag that squeaks when it shifts, and every few meters a chicken gives you the side eye. The year is 1879. Your name is Ferdinand Cheval. You're 43 years old, and you're just about done with other people telling you what's possible. You walk for hours every day, delivering letters through the hilly back roads of the Drôme region. You don't complain, not out loud anyway. Instead, you daydream. It helps distract from your sore knees and the donkey who always tries to nibble your coat buttons. And on this particular day, as you trip over a weirdly shaped stone half buried in the soil, something shifts in your mind. Now, you're probably not going to survive this walk in your current modern state. You don't have wool socks, the shoes are 2 sizes too small, and hydration comes in the form of tepid well water. But Ferdinand, he thrives on this stuff. Every mile is a rhythm, every stone a story. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from, what country, and what time is it there. I love knowing where my sleepy travelers are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The village of Hauterives isn't exactly bustling. There are a few houses, a bakery that smells better than it delivers, and lots of space to think. The sky stretches out like an old wool blanket, frayed, a little faded, and always drifting above you. You know these roads by heart. You've worn them down over the years. The same hills, same barking dogs, same grumpy neighbors with suspiciously unsealed letters. But today, your boot snags something.
It's a lump of limestone. Not very big, not very round, but it looks interesting. You hold it in your palm like a piece of candy that's slightly too big to chew. The texture is rough, like dried coral, and there's something oddly decorative about it. Most people would kick it aside. You, being you, put it in your mailbag, right next to Madame Delacroix's overdue tax notice. That's the moment, the one historians keep circling back to. Not when you started building, but when the idea started building you. Now, we need to talk about the life of a 19th century rural French postman, because it's not all letters and loaves of baguette. You walk, on average, 32 kilometers a day. That's almost 20 miles, and not the fun, flat kind. Think muddy inclines, overgrown goat paths, and the occasional overly affectionate goose. Your route isn't a loop, it's a line, which means when you finish, you walk it again in reverse. And the shoes? You might as well be barefoot in tree bark. The soles wear thin by month 3. Socks are patched until they resemble bandages. You've probably developed a sixth sense for the exact moment your heel is about to meet a thorn. But that daily trudge gives your mind room to wander. You start to imagine what you could build if you had more than a spade and some free evenings. At night, you read snippets of newspapers or catalogs. Mostly you squint at the pictures: Persian palaces, Hindu temples, medieval towers. You don't know the words for the architectural styles, but the shapes? Oh, the shapes are burned into your mind. And this isn't the first time you've been written off as odd. As a kid, you were a dreamer, the kind who builds little forts out of twigs and imagines dragons lurking behind barn doors. You never had a formal education past primary school. Life got in the way. Jobs needed doing. Families needed feeding.
But inside, the part of you that squints at clouds and sees castles, that never shut up. Here's your first quirky historical tidbit. Ferdinand Cheval wasn't entirely alone in his obsession with stones. In fact, in parts of rural France, it wasn't uncommon for farmers to use oddly shaped rocks as garden ornaments, boundary markers, or even primitive sundials. But building an entire palace, that's like saying you want to knit the moon a sweater. Historians still argue whether Cheval had ever seen a proper cathedral up close before his dream took hold. Some say he once visited Lyon and saw the basilicas there. Others believe his only exposure came from grainy black and white lithographs in second-hand almanacs. One camp insists it was divine inspiration. Another thinks he was just very, very bored. Either way, back in Hauterives, you've begun to gather more stones. You don't know why yet. You just know they're beautiful in a strange sort of way. The locals see you muttering to yourself, pulling pebbles from ditches and loading them into your bag alongside letters. They start whispering. But you keep walking and collecting. One smooth rock becomes 10, then a dozen, then hundreds. Your pockets sag, your back protests, but there's something soothing about it, something that makes the long miles feel purposeful. There's even a rumor that you once told a cow not to step on your favorite rock. No one knows if it's true, but honestly, it sounds like you. The first pile begins behind your house. Just a modest collection, maybe enough to confuse the neighborhood cats. But to you, it's the beginning of a dream that no one else can see. And so, the stage is set. A quiet village, a tired postman, and a growing mountain of stones waiting to become something impossible.
You start seeing stones everywhere now. Not just on your postal route, but in your dreams, under your dinner table, and tucked between your thoughts like sneaky little guests who refuse to leave. Each one is different. Some sharp like broken teeth, others smooth as river pebbles, all whispering their potential to you in their stony little voices. You begin sorting them. Flat ones in one corner, chunky, tooth-shaped ones in another. The ones with weird, coral-like pits get their own honored pile. Your neighbors start calling your house La Maison Bizarre. Kids dare each other to peek into your yard, and every time you leave for your postal shift, someone checks to see if you're still collecting rocks like a squirrel with a god complex. You say nothing. You just smile the quiet smile of a man who knows something the rest of the world doesn't. At this point, you're still just storing stones behind the house. No grand plan, no sketches, just possibility. But that nagging thought, what if, starts evolving into what next? Then one day, you bring home a wheelbarrow. It's not fancy, wobbly at best, but it's big enough to carry your favorite boulders and small enough to push across goat paths without flipping you into a ditch. You name it silently in your mind, the ship of dreams. Although you'd never say that out loud, not yet. And now your daily ritual changes. Mornings are for mail. You trudge the same long route, pausing to examine ditches, poke at mud with a stick, squint at oddly shaped clumps. Afternoons are for selection. You make return trips to snag the stones you mentally bookmarked. And evenings? Evenings are when you build.
Your first attempt is more of a lump than a wall. Think tired snowman meets mud pie. But you study it. You adjust your mixture of lime, water, sand, figuring out your own version of concrete through endless trial and error. There are no manuals, no YouTube tutorials, just your own tired hands and a gut feeling about what might hold. It's frustrating. You knock down more than you build at first. Your fingernails are permanently gray. Your arms ache in places you didn't know had muscles. Your dinner is always cold by the time you come in, but you keep at it. Here's where the absurd meets the admirable. Most people, after a week of evening stone stacking, would decide maybe it's time to just build a small fountain, something manageable. But not you. No, your mind is sketching columns and spires, temples and towers. You start imagining a palace that looks like it wandered away from its homeland. Part Hindu temple, part alpine chalet, part Gothic grotto. And what's even stranger? You start to see the outline of it. Not physically, yet, but in your head the shapes are becoming clearer. A turret here, a shell-shaped alcove there. You're building without blueprints, guided by instinct and, let's be honest, stubbornness. Let's pause here for our historical fact of the day. The term naive art, used later to describe Cheval's palace, wasn't coined until the 20th century. At the time Cheval was working, people didn't really have a category for eccentric peasant builds giant sculpture with no training. It didn't fit into their understanding of what art was supposed to be. It wasn't religious, it wasn't commissioned, and it certainly wasn't polite. But one thing they did understand was that Cheval was weirdly consistent. Every day, stones in, mail out, and he never stopped. Not for rain, not for snow, not for the ridicule of children who called his work a garbage castle.
In fact, the insults only seemed to make you more committed. One woman swears she saw you pick up a stone mid-insult, kiss it dramatically, and place it on top of your growing wall with a flourish. Another man, probably exaggerating, claims you once told a priest that your rocks spoke to you more honestly than half the town. The fringe tidbit here is you once considered giving the palace a moat. A full moat, with water and lilies and maybe a few decorative fish. You even dug a trench for it, but your shovel broke, and your back disagreed, and the dream faded back into the soil. Still, that idea lingered, and later sections of the palace would curve and wind in ways that hinted at that original watery ambition. Now, let's be honest. You're not a young man. You're in your mid-40s by now. Most people your age are preparing for retirement, or at least less back-breaking forms of creativity, like knitting or passively aggressively tending roses. But here you are, pushing rocks uphill in your spare time with no one cheering you on and absolutely no end in sight. Historians still debate whether Cheval's work was an act of spiritual devotion, personal therapy, or slow-burn defiance. Some lean toward religious fervor, pointing to the blend of sacred imagery etched into the walls. Others think it was a response to grief, poverty, or social exclusion, and one delightful theory insists it was an attempt to build something no one could take away from him. A monument to stubbornness itself. Whatever the motivation, you keep going. One pebble becomes a column. One archway leads to another, and soon the palace begins to emerge. Not just as a pile of rocks, but as a place. A labyrinth of curves and corners filled with possibilities that stretch far beyond what your neighbors can see. And still you say nothing. Because you don't need them to understand. You just need another wheelbarrow of stones.
The days start to blur in the most satisfying way. You wake, you walk, you deliver the letters, you find the stones, you build. The ritual settles into your bones until your muscles memorize the rhythm better than your thoughts ever could. By now, the neighbors have given up trying to understand you and have instead begun to tell stories about you. They call you le facteur fou, the mad postman. You don't mind, not really. After all, it's not like anyone else in Hauterives is doing anything particularly interesting.
Madame Belot's tomatoes aren't getting any redder. Old Bernard still curses at clouds like they owe him rent. Meanwhile, you're building a dream with your bare hands and a few 100 kilograms of stones you found while dodging aggressive sheep. The wall is no longer a wall. It has started to curve. You're experimenting with domes now, half spheres of rock held together with sand and spit and that peculiar mixture you still can't quite get to set properly in the rain. It collapses sometimes. That's fine. You start over. You always do. One of your arches, an attempt to mimic a Roman aqueduct, ends up shaped more like a drooping baguette. But you let it stand. There's something endearing about its slump. You name it in your head. La porte fatiguée, the tired gate. And through all of this, the man behind it, Ferdinand Cheval, remains stubbornly quiet. You're not writing manifestos, you're not giving interviews. You're barely even telling your friends what you're doing. Partly because they'll laugh, and partly because you're not entirely sure yourself. All you know is that the stones must be moved, and they must be placed. Let's pause on one mainstream historical fact. During this time in France, the idea of a self-taught artist wasn't widely accepted. The Académie des Beaux-Arts held the cultural monopoly on what counted as real art. Everything else, folly, hobby, nonsense. If you didn't wear a beret and suffer romantically in a garret somewhere, you weren't taken seriously.
But you don't need anyone's permission to build. That's the magic of what you're doing. You're not waiting for recognition. You're just creating. Your tools are rudimentary. Rusty trowels, makeshift scaffolding, a particularly sturdy stick that you pretend is a measuring rod, and your wheelbarrow. That dear old companion is now patched with bits of tin and wire. It squeaks like a tortured violin, but it still carries stones like a champ. Every evening, you light a single oil lamp. You place it on a stump so it casts long shadows over your growing structure. It's a strange thing, walking among what you've built in near darkness. The shadows make everything look grander. The flaws are softened. The curves glow. Sometimes you catch your breath and think, did I really do this? But then, inevitably, you trip over a chunk of stone and mutter something unprintable in sleepy French. Now, let's sprinkle in our fringe tidbit. There's a persistent local legend that you once tried to use molasses as a binding agent. Supposedly, you thought it might help the stones stick better. The result? A colony of ants so large and aggressive, even the cats kept their distance. Whether it's true or not, the tale lives on in village gossip. Historians still argue whether Cheval saw his creation as a literal palace or a symbolic one. Some say it was a childhood fantasy finally taking shape. Others suggest it was an act of resistance, a way of reclaiming power and identity in a world that offered little of either to a poor rural worker. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. It was simply a palace because you said it was.
By now, small structures begin to emerge. Grottos, niches, little towers topped with cones like frosting on a cake. You begin to carve inscriptions into the walls. Some are dates, marking milestones. Others are phrases, odd, poetic, ungrammatical. The work of one man, strange imagination, tenacity of a mule. Your French isn't always perfect, your spelling even less so, but no one corrects you, no one dares. One night, you dream that the palace is finished.
There are lanterns glowing in every alcove, staircases twisting toward the stars, and strange birds nesting in the eaves. When you wake, you're not sad that it isn't real yet. You're thrilled that it could be. Evenings start to stretch. You work longer. You eat later. Some nights you forget to eat at all. You fall asleep in your clothes, hands raw from lime, your back aching in satisfying new places. And then the whispers start up again in town. They say you're losing your mind, that you think you're a pharaoh, that the rocks are whispering to you. Someone claims you built a tunnel just to talk to your dead wife. Utter nonsense, of course. You didn't build a tunnel, just a very low corridor with poor lighting and terrible acoustics. But here's the truth. You have started talking to the stones. Not because you think they talk back, but because, well, someone should appreciate them. Each one has a different texture, a different weight, a different willingness to be part of the dream. Some nestle in just right. Others fight you like they're auditioning for a much grumpier palace. And still you walk every morning, delivering bills and birthday letters. You nod at the villagers who no longer bother hiding their smirks. You don't care, because you've seen what they haven't. You've seen the future palace in your mind. And it has just begun.
The palace is growing now, not just in height or breadth, but in ambition. What began as a humble wall made of mismatched stones has evolved into a sprawling patchwork of arches, balconies, columns, and crevices. None of it follows any recognizable architectural logic, and that's the point. You're not building according to a textbook. You're building from instinct, from dreams, from the odd angles of your memory. Every evening, after delivering letters and enduring small-town gossip, you roll up your sleeves and return to your creation. It's become your real life. Everything else just fills the hours between construction sessions. You've started giving names to the sections. Not for anyone else, just for yourself. One curved section of wall that leans dramatically to the left, that's the elephant cave. Not because there's an elephant there, although someday maybe there will be one, but because it reminds you of an elephant's belly mid-nap. Another area with pointy stone cones is dubbed the Temple of Ice Cream. You don't even particularly like ice cream, but the spires make you hungry. You're building the way a child draws, with imagination first and logic nowhere in sight. And it's glorious. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1879, the same year you began building your palace, the Eiffel Tower hadn't even been imagined yet. Paris was still steeped in neoclassicism and symmetry. If anyone had shown your palace to an architect of the day, they'd probably have dropped their monocle in horror. But you're 30 years ahead of the avant-garde and you don't even know it. Of course, there are challenges. The materials, for one. The stones you find aren't always the right shape or weight. You start carrying a chisel with you on your postal route. It's a dull thing, more like a grumpy spoon than a tool, but it helps. If a rock is too heavy, you sit down, huff a bit, and chip at it until it behaves. Cement is a headache. Lime is expensive. Sand is inconsistent. Rain ruins everything. And let's not even talk about winter, when your fingertips go numb before you even finish your first mix. You experiment with mixtures, some of which smell suspiciously like fermented cabbage, and eventually land on something that mostly holds, especially if you whisper nice things to it while it sets.
A fringe tidbit here: one night you try using milk in the mix, convinced it might add strength. It does not. It does, however, make the entire courtyard smell like expired cheese for 3 days. The local cats are thrilled. You are not. Still, you persist.
One morning, you overhear a farmer muttering that your palace looks like a chicken coop built by a man who's never seen a chicken. You smile, because he's not wrong, and because deep down you enjoy the confusion your work inspires. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate. Were you trying to provoke thought? Was there a message in the chaos? Some believe your mishmash of architectural styles was symbolic, a way of uniting the world through stones. Others believe you just liked the way things looked. One scholar even called your palace a visual encyclopedia written by someone who's never read a book. But to you, it's simple. You see beauty in the asymmetrical, the crooked, the peculiar. You believe that the divine can live in the ridiculous, that the world isn't supposed to make perfect sense, and neither is a palace. By now, a few brave souls are coming to visit. Not many, just a handful of curious passers-by or friends who finally give in to their curiosity. They walk through the arched entrance. They run their hands along the uneven walls. They try to interpret the carvings, the spires, the tiny staircases that lead nowhere. And almost all of them say the same thing. Why? You shrug, or you say something like, why not? Or, if you're feeling poetic, you point at a stone and say, that one asked for a home. They usually leave even more confused. You don't mind.
One of your favorite additions is a column that you build entirely from rounded stones, stacked so carefully that it looks like a tower of sleepy turtles. You love that column. It wobbles a bit in the wind, and it leans like it's listening to gossip, but it's yours. You wrap it in a little inscription that reads, "Even dreams need balance." A joke, of course. You didn't test the balance at all. You just got lucky. Another column, this one more stable, you cap with a small carved figure of a bird. It's not a real bird. Its proportions are suspiciously fish-like, but you don't care. It reminds you of something you saw once in a traveling circus. A bird that sang like a flute. Or maybe that was just a very confused man with a whistle. Memory is funny that way. You work into the twilight hours now, often by lamplight. Your shadow dances on the walls, and sometimes you hum to yourself. Old tunes, nonsense rhymes, the kind of songs that make your neighbors shake their heads and mutter, "There he goes again." But you're not just building anymore. You're living inside your imagination, and each stone you place makes the dream more real. You begin to keep a small notebook, not for measurements or diagrams, but for phrases, thoughts that come to you while working, bits of poetry, mottos. You write things like, "With courage, anything can be stone. My palace is silent, but it listens. Even the wind needs walls." You don't show the notebook to anyone. You're not building for praise. You're building because some part of you must.
You've reached the point where people stop calling your project a joke and start calling it a problem. The palace has become large enough to be noticeable, perhaps even concerning to the local authorities. There are whispers in the town hall, something about unauthorized structures and possible safety hazards. You overhear a man in a wool coat mutter the words, "blight on the landscape," as he walks past your date. You smile and wave, because your arches are higher now. Your domes curve more smoothly. Your stone menagerie of awkward animal shapes is beginning to look, if not beautiful, then at least deliberate. The children no longer giggle. They stare. Your postman duties continue, of course. You still walk those endless kilometers each morning, still drop letters into rusting mailboxes, still nod at the cows like old friends. But now, people recognize you not just as the postman, but the builder. And though they say it with a curl of skepticism, there's a growing edge of admiration underneath. Let's pause here for one mainstream historical fact. During the late 19th century in France, rural architecture followed very strict patterns. Most houses were built with plain facades, practical layouts, and little ornamentation. Function was prized over form. A house that stood out was often seen as a threat to order, or worse, a sign of madness. So when you started carving lotus flowers into archways and embedding snail shells into the mortar, it wasn't just odd, it was borderline rebellious. But that's never been your concern. You work slowly, but with absolute consistency. One stone at a time, every day. Your progress isn't marked in floors or wings or domes. It's marked in calluses. Your hands are no longer hands. They're sculptor's tools, gritty, swollen, perpetually dusty. It's around this time you begin experimenting with new shapes. You build what you call the Tower of Barbary Birds, even though you've never seen a Barbary bird and probably couldn't describe one if asked. You just like the sound of it. The tower is tall, fragile, and lopsided, but yet it somehow holds. You crown it with a little open cup in which real birds occasionally land and judge your craftsmanship.
Then there's the Grotto of Silence, a small shaded nook beneath a leaning wall, decorated with seashells you either found or bought off a traveling merchant. You're not telling. When you sit inside it, the air goes still. Even the wind seems to hush itself. You spend entire evenings in that grotto, listening to nothing. Now, for a little-known fringe tidbit, one visitor claimed quite seriously that they saw you speaking to a bat inside the grotto. You allegedly bowed to it and called it Monsieur Architect. When questioned, you blinked slowly and said, "He has strong opinions about arches." No one knows if this happened, but the story persists. The bat remains anonymous. Historians still debate whether you were trying to tell a story through the palace or simply escape from one. Was this a narrative in stone? A visual autobiography? Some believe each section represents a chapter of your life, the early walls being your youth, the complex staircases your middle age, the tower your dreams of transcendence. Others think the entire structure is just a wandering thought that got out of hand. You, of course, don't explain. You just build. But the townsfolk, once amused, then annoyed, are now split. Some say it's inspiring. Others mutter about property taxes. A few believe you've been touched by some divine eccentricity, a rare French saint of cement and grit. And then come the complaints. An inspector arrives one warm afternoon. He's not very tall, but his mustache makes up for it. He wears a stiff hat and carries a clipboard like it might explode. He pokes at your walls, measures a few things, steps back, sighs dramatically. He asks questions like, "Do you know this isn't a regulated building? Where is your permission from the council? Is that a snake carved into the drain pipe?" You nod politely and answer nothing.
Because what could you say? That this isn't a building, it's a dream made visible? That there is no council form for what you've built? That the snake is probably just a mistake you didn't bother fixing? In the end, the inspector leaves with more questions than he came with. He files a report, nothing happens. And that's when you begin carving messages into the very walls themselves. Subtle acts of defiance. Beneath one balcony, you write, "This is the work of a dreamer. Respect the dream or leave it alone." Beneath another arch, "Built by one man, mocked by many, loved by the stones." No one knows quite what to do with that. Now your palace has staircases that double back on themselves, columns shaped like tree trunks, grottos with dripping stalactites made of melted bottles and pink sandstone, One day you start embedding bits of glass into the walls to catch the light. The sun dances across them like an untrained ballerina. Children call it the glitter house. You correct them. It's the ideal palace now. That name has arrived in your mind, and you accept it without question. The palace's layout is confusing. You don't work in straight lines. There's no grid, no symmetry, just flow. Sometimes a staircase leads to nowhere. Other times a tunnel ends in a window with no glass, just a view of the field and a particularly unimpressed dote. And yet, there is harmony in the nonsense, beauty in the asymmetry. One traveler, probably lost, stumbles onto your property and stands silent for 5 full minutes. Then he whispers, "It's like Gaudi," but sleep-deprived. You don't know who Gaudi is. You nod anyway. You start building inwards now, creating rooms within rooms, caves within towers. At one point, you fashion a small stone chair into the wall itself. You sit on it. It's wildly uncomfortable. You smile. Every stone has weight, texture, personality. You know where each one came from. Some from riverbeds, some from quarry scraps. One, your favorite, was found beside a hedgerow during a thunderstorm. It still smells vaguely of moths and lightning. The world doesn't understand. But the stones, oh, they do.
The wheelbarrow creaks louder these days. One of its handles is cracked. The wheel wobbles with every step, and you've patched the rusting metal tray with an old horseshoe and some hope. Still, it moves. It carries stone after stone, sometimes up to 40 kilograms at a time, down winding footpaths and back alleys, over tree roots and muddy gullies. And it's just you. Always just you. No apprentices, no architects, no assistants with strong backs. Just a middle-aged postman with a burning idea and a half-broken wheelbarrow that, frankly, deserves its own plaque by now. This thing has become your companion, your co-creator, your creaky steed of impossible dreams. Your route has changed slightly. Not the mail route, that's still strictly assigned, but your stone route. You've started scouting deeper into the woods, along riverbanks, even across neighboring fields. You know every pebble within a 5-kilometer radius like old friends. You've begun to classify them mentally, the flapy ones that crumble under pressure, the stubborn ones that refuse to fit anywhere, but somehow still get carried home, the rare, smooth, coral-like ones you call lucky bones. Some days you barely deliver the letters on time. You get distracted. One rock catches your eye, and you lose 15 minutes just holding it, weighing it, turning it in your hand like a strange fruit. The letters still go out eventually, but people have started complaining that their mail smells suspiciously like wet gravel. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. The average lifespan for a rural French laborer in the late 1800s hovered around 50. You're now closing in on that, and instead of slowing down, you're doubling your workload. Most men your age are praying for a quiet job near a warm stove. You're hauling 300 kilograms of rubble across uneven terrain in your spare time. You start working by moonlight. You figure out which nights give the best visibility, the ones when the moon hangs low like a watching eye. You like building at night. It's quieter. There are fewer distractions. No one asking what you're doing, no cows staring, no children laughing.
Only the soft sounds of rock on rock, the gentle swish of your trowel in the lime mix, and the rhythmic wheeze of the wheelbarrow, which, if you listen closely, sounds almost like it's humming along. Your neighbors shake their heads. There goes Cheval, they say, off to build his nonsense castle again. but their tone is softening. It's no longer mockery. It's almost respect. Maybe confusion tinged with admiration? A few begin to linger by the fence. They ask shyly if they can look closer. One man brings you a stone he thinks is pretty. You thank him. You don't use it, but you place it on a shelf near the entrance where it catches the afternoon light. And then come the goats. Yes, goats. You've never invited them, of course, but something about the construction site seems to attract them. Maybe it's the salt in the mortar. Maybe it's the curious curves and crevices that look like jungle gyms. Whatever the reason, you now have a small entourage of ungulate spectators. They wander through archways, they nap beside your wheelbarrow. One particularly bold goat climbs a staircase and poses majestically on a half-finished balcony like she owns the place. You call her Madame Architect. You begin to build with the goats in mind, widening stair steps so they can climb them, smoothing ledges so they don't hurt their hooves. At one point, you even leave out a shallow basin filled with water. Whether for the goats or the birds or the spirits of stones past, you're not sure. It just feels right. Here's our fringe tidbit. One night, a traveler swears he saw you whispering instructions to a goat wearing a piece of cloth around its neck. When asked if this was true, you supposedly said, "She's in charge of the North Wing now." The story spreads, and for a while children begin referring to your palace as Le Château de Chèvre, the Castle of Goats.
Historians still argue whether the presence of animals influenced the palace's design. Some claimed the winding, low-slung pathways were goat trails first, formalized later by human hands. Others insist Cheval was simply eccentric and animal-friendly. One overly poetic academic even suggested that the goats became metaphors for stubborn persistence. You'd probably just laugh. What's undeniable is that the goats make good company. They don't ask questions, they don't judge your lack of symmetry, and they don't care that your latest spire leans like it's had a bit too much wine. Meanwhile, you start carving more. Not just phrases now, but figures, faces, animals, symbols. Some are recognizable, a lion, a palm tree, a starburst. Others are completely made up. A creature that looks like an owl wearing a hat, a fish with human eyes, a sun that's grinning just a little too wide. You let your hands guide you. There's no plan, no reference. You chip away until the shape feels right. Some look beautiful, others less so, but they all stay. Every mistake is part of the palace now. You add alcoves and columns, benches and bridges. You start using seashells, bits of glass, even broken porcelain to decorate the walls. Someone gives you a cracked teacup, blue and white china with a floral motif. You embed it right above the main doorway. It catches the sunrise like a gem. By this point, people from neighboring villages have started hearing about you. They come on foot, sometimes on horseback, just to see. They don't always speak. They just stand there, staring at the twisted wonderland rising behind your garden fence. And you keep building, one stone at a time. Your palace is now taller than your house. It's wider than your lot. It is grown the way a tree grows, imperfectly, wildly, with limbs that twist toward light no one else can see. And that wheelbarrow, still going, still creaking, you patch it again, with a belt this time. You pat its side like an old friend. Because the palace may be your masterpiece, but the wheelbarrow, that's your most loyal collaborator.
By now, your neighbors no longer ask what you're building. They've resigned themselves to the fact that no answer would ever quite make sense. The palace has outgrown explanation. It's too large, too intricate, too odd. What began as a strange hobby has become something else entirely. A landmark, a rumor, a myth with a postal address. The mail keeps arriving, and so do the people. Not just locals anymore, but travelers from farther away, curious souls, artists, writers, a few overly earnest men with sketchbooks and spectacles. They take notes, ask awkward questions like, "What movement would you say this represents?" and squint up at your leaning towers with a kind of confused reverence. You answer them all the same way, a shrug, a smile, and a quiet, "It's just stones." But of course, it isn't. Not anymore. You've carved messages into nearly every surface now, some deep, some scratched faintly like secrets. One reads, "I wanted to prove what tenacity can do." Another, "The dream of one man born in silence." And another, half buried behind a growing vine, "I walked for stones and they walked with me." Let's pause here for a mainstream historical fact. By the 1890s, France was deep into its obsession with classical education and structured knowledge. Schools were emphasizing logic and linear thinking, neat answers and neat buildings. And here you were, building curves that led nowhere and towers that leaned on nothing but faith and a good wind.
There's a new section of the palace taking shape now. You've started calling it the Temple of Nature. It features animals, plants, and something you insist is a volcano, though it looks suspiciously like an upside-down pear. Still, it's a temple because you say it is. You fill it with carvings of trees, roots, vines that crawl around doorframes. It's your homage to life outside straight lines. And then, something unexpected. One morning on your postal route, a boy runs up to you with something in his hands. It's a stone, but not just any stone. It's heart-shaped, smooth, reddish, perfectly curved. The boy says, "For your castle." You take it like it's a treasure. You embed it at the center of a new archway and carve around it. Gifted by a child, held by a dream. That small moment opens a new chapter. People begin bringing you things. A fisherman donates a chipped anchor. A widow offers a broken mirror. A mason gives a bag of leftover tiles. You use all of it, not just for decoration, but as tributes, each one a piece of someone else's story folded into your own. And so, the palace becomes more than yours. It becomes a vessel for other people's quiet dreams. Here's our fringe tidbit. At one point, a traveling circus stops in town. One of the clowns, out of makeup, sipping coffee, wanders into your garden and stares at the palace for 20 minutes. Then he turns to you and says, "You ever think it's too much?" You blink, offer him a stone shaped like a crescent moon, and say, "Only on Wednesdays." He leaves, visibly unnerved.
Historians still argue whether this marks the shift from a private creation to a public monument. Some say it was always meant to be shared. Others insist it remained deeply personal, no matter how many visitors cross the threshold. But everyone agrees, this was the moment people began calling it the ideal palace in earnest. Not as a joke, not as sarcasm, but with something like awe. The structure now sprawls across your property like an enormous dream day. There are towers with spiral stairs that go up and then back down again, balconies that overlook nothing in particular, alcoves filled with figurines you carve from leftover cement, creatures from your imagination, or maybe just exaggerated cats. You begin collecting seashells more seriously now.
Not just the occasional odd one, but whole baskets. You embed them in the walls like jewels. You create mosaics, a sun made of yellow shells, a lizard with a tail of polished pebbles. Someone asks if you're referencing ancient Roman decoration. You nod, but the truth is, you just like how they shimmer in the light. Visitors start writing about you. Small articles appear in local papers. Some call you a genius in overalls. Others say you're a reminder of what a single human can do when they're not watching the clock. A young woman sketches one of your towers and mails you a copy. You frame it in the palace, carving a frame into the wall itself. Beneath it, you inscribe, "She saw what I saw." That is enough. And through all of this, the praise, the visitors, the muttered admiration, you remain the same. You still walk your route every morning, still carry your letters, still nod at goats and collect stones on the way home. You never dress fancy. You never claim a title. You never charge an entrance fee. You just keep building, because that's what you do. You've become part of the structure now. Your routines are carved into its bones. Your stories are held in its grooves. And as it rises around you, it carries more than stone. It carries meaning.
Some mornings, the palace seems to breathe. Not in a supernatural way, not like the walls are pulsing or the spires sigh, but in a gentler, more human sense. Like it's waking up just as you are, stretching its shadow across the garden as the sun climbs over the rooftops. You step out with your satchel of letters, squint at the sky, and nod toward your strange, stone-born companion. It nods back. Probably. You can't be sure anymore. Your routine has become sacred. You deliver the mail with quiet purpose, and then as the village turns inward for lunch or rest, you slip away and begin your real work. The wheelbarrow still groans under the weight of dreams. Your hands still ache in new, exciting places. But now there's a rhythm to it that makes the pain feel like proof. You've started building vertically again. The newer towers are narrow and peculiar, shaped like corkscrews or melting candlesticks. There's no real logic to their design, just intuition. You often balance a single oddly shaped rock at the top, stepping back with squinting eyes to assess the absurdity. And when it doesn't fall, well, that's what you call engineering. Let's anchor this moment with the mainstream historical fact. In 1905, France was on the brink of major cultural change. The nation was preparing for full separation of church and state. Meanwhile, art movements like Fauvism and early Cubism were starting to form in urban centers. Yet in Hauterives, none of that seems to matter. You are both behind and ahead of your time, an untrained visionary making concrete poetry while Paris argues about brushstrokes and political boundaries. But the palace is now undeniably something. Even your fiercest doubters must admit that. The townspeople are warming up. Some even bring their friends to see your work, whispering as they pass through your gates, careful not to disturb the maestro, which is what some of them have started calling you, though you still preferred Cheval. Children come to play near the arches. They chase each other through the narrow corridors. One girl tells you she thinks your tallest tower looks like a wizard's hat. You laugh and name it Tour de Magicienne, the sorceress's tower. You add a small spiral to the side, just for her. And then the letters arrive.
Not mail you deliver, but mail for you. Letters from strangers. Notes from dreamers, artists, travelers who passed through your garden and felt something they couldn't explain. One letter reads, "Dear Monsieur Cheval, I saw your palace and wept. I don't know why. Thank you for showing the world what it means to build with belief." Another is shorter. "I came, I saw, I tripped on a step, and I still loved it." You pin them to your walls. Not the palace walls, your house walls. the ones inside the little cottage you still live in, just 10 meters away from a colonnade that could rival a fever dream. Now for a fringe tidbit. At some point, you start writing poetry and hiding it inside the palace itself. Yes, inside. You roll tiny scrolls of handwritten verses and tuck them into cracks behind carvings. Most are only a few lines. One reads, "No book could hold what the stones have said, so I gave them voices instead." It becomes a secret game for some visitors, looking for hidden poems in the nooks of your creation. You never confirm it's real. You just smile. Historians still argue whether the poetry was meant for future generations or just your own amusement. Some suggest it was your way of fighting the fleeting nature of life, preserving thought not on paper, but in cement, so it might last a century instead of a season. Others believe it was a private joke. Either way, the scrolls are real. At least a few have been found. Your body is older. You feel it. Climbing the scaffold hurts more than it used to. Your hands are slower. You rest more often, but not for long. You can't stay away. The palace calls to you like a friend waiting at a favorite cafe. When you walk through its corridors now, you touch the walls like checking for a heartbeat. And it's always there. One corner of the palace is particularly strange. You've started building a small grotto there with an underground tunnel, one barely big enough for a person to crawl through. People ask what it's for. You say, it's a tunnel for silence. And that's all. Later, you add an inscription near the entrance.
All men need a quiet path, even if it goes nowhere. The goats still visit, so do the birds. One clever magpie builds a nest in a hollow tower and steals a spoon from your kitchen. You let her keep it. Your family, by now, is used to it. Your daughter grows up with the palace as her backyard. She doesn't question it. It's simply always been there. Sometimes she helps you haul stones. Sometimes she rolls her eyes. Either way, she knows her father is not like other fathers. One evening, as the sun sets and the entire palace glows warm and golden, a man visiting from Paris stands before your gate and says, "It's not just a building. It's a monument to possibility." You think about that for a long time. And then you go back to mixing cement, because that's what you do. Not for glory, not for recognition, not even for legacy, but because you've made a promise to the stones, to yourself, to something older than either. And there's still more work to do.
You begin dreaming in arches. Not metaphorically, literally. At night, your mind builds when your body cannot. Towers stack themselves behind your eyes. Staircases loop in impossible directions. In sleep, you construct with the same quiet urgency that guides you in waking life. You wake up with sketches burned into your memory, not on paper, of course, but in the tallest blueprint of your palms. It's become harder to tell where your life ends and the palace begins. Your tools, once stored neatly, now rest wherever you last dropped them. A trowel sleeps beside the goat basin. A chisel lounges on the ledge of a spiral staircase. You keep meaning to tidy up, but every time you try, your eyes catch on a gap in a wall or a lopsided ornament, and before you know it, you're back at work, lost in some new idea. Let's anchor this with a mainstream historical fact. Around 1910, France was brimming with innovation. Automobiles were growing popular. The Eiffel Tower had become a symbol of modern triumph. Art Nouveau had swept through cities like a graceful vine. But you were still mixing lime and sand in a rusted bucket, stacking stones into sculptures no one could quite categorize. And that was precisely the point. A man visits one day, a journalist, he says. He walks slowly through your garden, notebook in hand, muttering phrases like visionary outsider and vernacular expressionism. You offer him a cup of water in a chipped mug that once served as the head of a gargoyle. He drinks, scribbles something, then asks, "Are you building art?" You shake your head and say, "I'm just finishing a walk that got out of hand." It becomes his headline. You don't read it, but someone tells you later, and you nod. You've started reinforcing older parts of the palace. Some of your early arches are beginning to crumble just slightly. Not dangerously, just tired. Like knees after too many winters. You shore them up lovingly, like bandaging an old friend. You whisper to the walls sometimes, not because you think they listen, because you do. And now for a fringe tidbit. You begin carving miniature versions of the palace inside the palace. Tiny doorways beneath staircases, miniature turrets tucked into corners. One visitor calls it architecture with a sense of humor. Another says it feels like being watched by the building itself. You pretend not to hear. Historians still argue about these miniature replicas. Were they prototypes, jokes, a quiet form of commentary on your own work? One scholar insists it was a meta-gesture, a palace building a palace. You likely would have said it looked like it belonged there, and kept carving. The palace is now something of a pilgrimage site. Artists, writers, teachers, a few quiet mystics. They come not just to see, but to feel, to understand what could possess a man to haul 40,000 stones by hand over decades without once asking for payment or permission. You still don't charge admission. You never will. Some days people leave gifts. Flowers tucked into wall cracks, poems written on paper scraps, sketches folded into jars. You hide a few of them inside alcoves. Others you simply smile at before tucking them into your coat pocket. They'll resurface weeks later when you're searching for a nail. And now you begin constructing what might be your most ambitious feature yet, a 3-level gallery that winds upward in a spiral. You call it the Tower of Time. Its outer walls are covered in tiny carvings, stars, clocks, waves, leaves, and faces. One of them is yours, an accidental likeness etched in a half-dream.
It takes months. You nearly give up twice. Once when a storm collapses a scaffold. Once when your knee locks up for an entire week. And you think, well, perhaps the stones have finally outpaced me. But then you mend. Slowly, painfully, you build a new scaffold. You tuck to your knees. You say, just a little longer, eh? And they listen. That tower, once completed, becomes your favorite spot in the entire palace. You climb it when no one's around, sit at the top step, look out over the village rooftops, the goats, the trees, the stones still waiting for their chance to join your dream. And you breathe. From here, the palace doesn't look like madness. It doesn't even look strange. It looks inevitable, as if it had always meant to grow from this patch of French soil, and you were simply the one patient enough to let it happen.
The village no longer wonders if the palace will ever be finished. They now ask how far you'll go. The structure has become part of the landscape, woven into the daily rhythm of Hauterives like church bells and harvest smoke. Locals pass it with casual awe, like it's always been there. Children point to it when explaining directions. Farmers, once skeptical, now pause to chat as you mix cement in your garden, asking, "What are you building today, Monsieur Cheval?" You always give the same answer. "We'll see where the stones want to go." By now, your body carries the shape of your creation. Your back curves like an arch. Your hands are permanent maps of labor. You've developed a kind of sixth sense for balance,
an ability to tell if a stone will hold simply by feeling it rest in your palm. You know when it's time to stop for the day, not because the sun sets, but because the walls tell you they've had enough. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1912, just a few hundred kilometers from you, the Titanic set sail and famously sank. Engineers had poured modern science into its design, promising safety, strength, and unsinkable glory. Meanwhile, you, without blueprints, without formal education, were still building a monument by feel and instinct, one pebble at a time. And yours still stands. Your neighbors start calling the palace a miracle, but you know better. It's not a miracle. It's a commitment, a 30-year conversation between you and the earth. Somewhere near the entrance, you inscribe, "What man dreams he can build. What man builds he must honor." You've begun creating passageways underground, low, winding tunnels that loop back on themselves like sleeping snakes. You reinforce them with bits of old metal and polished stone, creating a glow even in the dark. Some visitors are too nervous to enter. Others crawl inside and come out changed. And here's a fringe tidbit. You install a stone bench halfway through one of the tunnels with no exit on either side. It's just there, a chamber of quiet. When asked why, you reply, "Sometimes a place just wants to be alone." A journalist writes that down and calls it existential architecture. You never read the article. Historians still argue whether the palace was meant to be experienced linearly, one room leading to the next in progression, or if it was intentionally disorienting, like a dreamscape with no entry or exit. One theory posits that you were creating a kind of labyrinth, not to trap others, but to free yourself, a way to get lost on purpose. The palace continues to rise. You add spiral staircases that don't reach the ground, bridges that cross over thin air. An elephant appears near the center courtyard, trunk raised in stone celebration. You've never seen a real elephant, but you've read about them in old papers. Your version is wildly inaccurate, wonderfully strange, and utterly perfect. Soon after, a camel joins the elephant, then a deer, then a peacock. You've started creating a zoo of stone, not anatomically correct, mind you, but bursting with charm. They gather under an arched banner that reads, "Tribute to all living creatures, large, imagined, and beloved." Visitors adore this menagerie. Children gasp. Artists sketch. One old man tips his hat to the elephant and says, "You're far from India, my friend." You don't tell him the elephant's name is Bernadette.
You now build with memory. Each wall holds echoes, each corner a story. One ledge reminds you of your mother's hands. A spire makes you think of a sunrise during a childhood illness when you believed the light alone had healed you. You start embedding objects, not just stones and shells, but fragments of life. A broken brooch, the clasp of an old pocket watch, a ceramic button from a neighbor's discarded coat. Each item has a whisper, a small claim to existence. You write no guidebook, you create no legend. You let the palace speak for itself. And it does. It sings through the cracks in the walls, through the archways that frame the sky, through the stairways that lead to places you haven't named yet. Because, after all, it is still growing, always growing, and so are you. You're beginning to lose count, not just of the stones. You gave up trying to tally those long ago, but of the days, the years, the tiny injuries, the inexplicable triumphs.
You no longer remember when your hands weren't coated in dust, or when your back didn't crack like a brittle page turning each morning. And yet, here you are, still building, still dreaming, still adding to a creation that has become your second skin. Visitors now come daily, not in droves, this isn't Paris after all, but in a slow, steady trickle, like the palace is magnetizing wanderers from the corners of France and beyond. They step through your garden gate as if entering another world. Some whisper, some laugh quietly in disbelief, some stand very still, as though afraid to wake the dream. You offer no tour, no map. The ideal palace is meant to wander like a forest, each twist and turn revealing something unexpected. A statue of a deer half hidden in ivy, a stairway that ends at a wall of stars, a carved quote that reads, "To walk without purpose is the purest freedom." Let's ground ourselves with a mainstream historical fact. In 1914, World War I begins. France, like much of Europe, is plunged into chaos, fear, and grief. Young men are conscripted, families are broken, towns are emptied. But in Hauterives, amid the worry and the wartime rationing, one man continues to build, quietly, doggedly, as if the world's fury cannot penetrate his walls of stone and wonder. You feel the war in ripples, of course. The village changes. Some faces disappear. Letters you deliver become more somber. Black ribbons on doorposts. Grief wrapped in envelopes. But you keep working. Because what else can you do?
The palace becomes a kind of quiet defiance, a monument to the things that endure when nations tear themselves apart. Visitors now leave offerings. One woman ties a silk ribbon to the wrist of your elephant statue. Another places a wildflower in the beak of a stone pelican. You don't touch these gifts. They're not for you. They're for the palace. And it accepts them. Here's a fringe tidbit. A poet once visited and spent an entire afternoon writing sonnets to your staircases. He insisted each one had a personality, some moody, some flirtatious, one suspiciously shy. He read the poems aloud to the walls. You offered him a cup of lukewarm tea. He cried. Historians still debate whether your creation qualifies as art, architecture, or outsider expression. The terms never quite fit. The palace resists categorization, like you. It's too ornamental to be practical, too functional to be sculpture, too dreamlike to be a building, and too solid to be a dream. And that's exactly how you like it. You've started building a kind of colonnade, a row of twisted columns that lean and lurch, but somehow hold. Some are embedded with tiles and broken china. One contains the base of an old wine bottle you found near the river. When the sun hits it just right, the column glows faint green. You name the colonnade Le Chemin des Âmes Perdues, the path of lost souls. It sounds morbid, but it isn't. It's peaceful, reflective, a place for wandering thoughts. In the center, you carve a phrase that makes even the most talkative visitors fall silent.
We are all buildings under construction. And there's truth in that. You feel it in your joints. Your knees now click like unreliable gears. You rest more often, sometimes just sitting on a ledge, watching dust settle in beams of light. And the light is different here, softer, more reverent, as if the palace itself
filters it, purifies it, gives it back to the world more gently than before. You now sculpt with a kind of instinct. Shapes flow from your hands before your brain catches up. You trust the process, trust the stones. You've come to believe that each one wants to belong somewhere. You're just the matchmaker. Visitors bring their own stories. Some weep, some laugh. One woman touches a stone arch and whispers, "He built what I only dared to imagine." You don't interrupt her moment. You just go back to mixing your mortar. Your daughter, now older, begins to understand. Not just the palace, but you. She visits more often, brings you lunch sometimes, asks how your hands are. You show her a new carving, a lion wearing spectacles, and she rolls her eyes but smiles. She gets it. And now, perhaps for the first time, you begin to realize that this thing you've built is bigger than even you had imagined, not just in size, but in meaning, in resonance, in the way it pulls people in and lets them breathe differently for a while. The palace isn't just stone. It's proof. Proof that patience has form, that imagination doesn't need permission, that even a postman with no training, no tools beyond the simplest ones, and no guidance beyond intuition can create something timeless. You never call yourself an artist. You just say, "I had a dream, and I walked it into being." And the palace? It agrees.
The palace is beginning to speak for itself now. Not literally, though some claim they've heard it whisper in the wind, but in the way all great things eventually develop a kind of presence, a soul stitched from repetition and care. You walk its pathways less like a builder and more like a custodian, a caretaker of something that no longer belongs entirely to you. Children laugh louder near the animal statues. Elderly visitors lean on railings you shaped years ago with aching arms and a level made from string and faith. And artists, they stare for hours at a single column, scribbling furiously, trying to bottle whatever it is your stones are saying. You find it funny. You never thought of the palace as mysterious. To you, it has always been obvious. It wanted to be born. You just showed up with a wheelbarrow. You've begun expanding outward again, not just up or down, but sideways, elongating a wing of the palace that stretches toward your neighbor's fence. No one minds. They've stopped asking questions. If anything, they quietly root for you. Some bringing water when the days are hot. A few offer tools. One farmer gives you an old shutter with carved iron hinges. You turn it into a balcony for the camel. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In the 1910s, as modernism surged in art and architecture, clean lines, machine precision, concrete minimalism, you were doubling down on chaos and curves. While Le Corbusier was drafting principles of design and stiff fonts, you were sculpting vines that wrapped around staircases and towers that tilted like curious sunflowers. Your new section is an open-air courtyard with 3 arches stacked on top of one another, each one different. The lowest arch is rough, chunky, defiant. The middle one is neat and mathematically proud. The top, crooked as a child's grin. You call it la voix de rire, the voice of laughter. You say it's for the stones that wanted to be silly.
And here's a fringe tidbit. Somewhere in this courtyard, you carve a lizard wearing boots. No one asks why. Maybe no one sees it. Maybe it's for you alone. A reminder that this has always been play as much as passion. A child's dream scaled up to the size of stubbornness. You now spend much of your time fine-tuning rather than creating. You run your hands over surfaces, sanding edges that feel too sharp, carving new texture into bare spaces. The palace never asks to be finished, it only asks to be tended. Historians still argue whether this period of refinement was intentional, an artistic evolution, or simply your body's way of slowing without stopping. One theory suggests you had always planned a palace's shape down to the last detail and were now merely fulfilling the design. Another claims you were improvising until the end. Both are wrong, of course. You were listening. One evening, a storm sweeps through Hauterives. Thunder cracks, rain slices the air. You watch from your doorway as the water runs over the stonework, turning your dream into a soaked cathedral. You hold your breath. And when the sun returns the next day, nothing has fallen. Not a column, not a railing, not even the boots on the lizard. You touch the stones and feel warmth returning to them, like a pulse. You say quietly, "Good job." And the palace doesn't answer, but it doesn't need to.
Visitors continued to leave small tributes. A seashell from Brittany, a scrap of lace, a child's drawing of a dragon that vaguely resembles your elephant. You place it beneath the carving and protect it with glass. Your daughter begins keeping a notebook. She sketches parts of the palace. She asks questions about the arches, the pathways, the symbols you've etched into corners no one can see. You realize she's cataloging it, not for you, but for the world that will eventually try to make sense of it. You don't stop her, but you say gently, "Let them wonder." And they will. Because you've begun carving messages not in French, but in invented script, glyphs of your own making, spirals, lines, dots, a secret language, maybe nonsense, maybe poetry. You refuse to explain. To some, it's infuriating. To others, it's enchanting. But to you, it's simply yours. At the center of the newest tower, you embed a stone unlike any other, jet black, smooth, heavy. You don't remember where you found it, just that when you saw it, you knew it was meant for this exact place. You build around it like it's a heart. Above it, you carve a final phrase. Everything impossible begins as a pebble in the pocket. And that, you think, says more than any blueprint ever could.
By now, there are parts of the palace even you forget you've built. Small nooks tucked behind spiraling walls. Shadowed alcoves where light gathers in quiet pools. You'll be carrying a stone, turn a familiar corner, and suddenly remember a statue you sculpted 5 years ago. A bird mid-flap with one wing cracked just slightly. You don't fix the crack. It belongs now, like a wrinkle on an old smile. The palace has become a kind of memory machine. Not just your memories, but others. Visitors now describe feelings they didn't expect. A teacher says it reminds her of a grandmother's garden. A man cries softly beneath a crooked column and won't explain why. A little girl brings her grandfather every Sunday, pointing out new details. He's too nearsighted to see, but he listens carefully to every word anyway. You never intended to build a sanctuary, but maybe the best sanctuaries are accidental. Let's ground this with a mainstream historical fact. In 1916, as World War I roars through Europe, the Battle of Verdun becomes one of the longest and bloodiest in history. More than 300 days of relentless fighting. And yet, for all that destruction, here, in a quiet corner of southeastern France, you're stacking stones with infinite patience, creating something that grows instead of breaks.
The contrast is surreal. Letters from soldiers arrive in town with postmarks smudged in mud and blood. You deliver them quietly, respectfully, then return to your palace. You work a little slower those days, not because of grief, but because each gesture now feels sacred. The palace doesn't ignore the world. It just answers it differently.
And here's a fringe tidbit. Somewhere near the back of the palace, you build a sculpture of a sleeping dog. It's nestled beneath a column, paws tucked under its chin. You never explain it. People speculate. Was it a real dog? A metaphor? You simply smile and whisper to it, "Guard well." Historians still argue whether this period marks your transition from builder to philosopher. Your carvings take on a more cryptic tone, less direct, more dreamlike. One reads, "Time loops where hands build without clocks." Another, "What you see is only half the story. The rest waits in the mortar." Visitors begin to linger longer. Some ask to stay overnight. One woman brings her easel and paints the same column every afternoon for a week, saying, "It changes with the light." You don't tell her she's right. You just leave her a cup of tea and a spoon carved from stone. The palace now spans the entire garden. You have to walk around it, not just through. Some parts you barely fit into anymore. You crouch to pass under an arch made for a version of you 10 years younger and 6 inches more limber. You laugh at your own past optimism. Your daughter continues recording details. She started giving names to areas you never thought needed them. The Whispering Gate, the Crooked Chapel, the Fountain of Strangers. You nod at her titles. Some stick, others don't. The palace chooses in the end. One day, while repairing a loose mosaic tile shaped like a sunflower, you overhear 2 visitors talking. One says, "Do you think he knew what he was doing?" The other replies, "Maybe not, but he did it anyway." And you smile.
Because that's exactly right. You've begun carving celestial motifs, moons, stars, suns with human faces. You scatter them along the rooftops as though building a sky to match the stone earth below. One tower ends in a spiral with a single phrase at its peak. To climb is to remember the sky exists. Your legs ache more now. You don't climb like you used to. You spend more time on the ground, adding smaller details, perfecting textures, whispering encouragement to the foundations. You talk to the stones openly these days. No one finds it strange. Because by now, people believe in the palace. They believe in you. Not like a saint, not like a genius, but like something rarer. A man who meant it. You've begun embedding fragments of glass in some of the upper walls. Not many, just enough to catch light at dusk. The effect is subtle, small bursts of gold and red and green, like the palace is blushing under attention. Children call them magic windows. You don't correct them. And late at night, when the wind is still and the moon hangs over the arches like a guardian, you walk the palace alone. No tools, no cart, just your steps, just your breath, just the sound of the gravel underfoot and the distant echo of a dream being realized. And in those quiet moments, you no longer feel like a man walking through something he built. You feel like a man being walked through by something bigger.
The seasons have begun to leave their own marks. Each winter dusts the palace in delicate frost, turning every carved lion and spiral staircase into a silent snow monument. Spring arrives with a whisper, wildflowers pushing through cracks between the stones as if the earth is offering tiny applause. In summer, ivy creeps lovingly across the columns and bees hum around the hollow domes. Autumn rains wash the dust from your sculptures, revealing the smooth glimmer beneath. You never planned for the seasons, but the palace accepts them, embraces them, wears them like garments. And now, as your hands slow, as your breath grows shorter with the weight of years, the structure feels less like your creation and more like your companion, aging with you, weathering with you, surviving with you. You've started a new wall. It's lower than the others, less ambitious, but covered entirely with script, not decorative letters or plaques. Your writing, your beliefs, your jokes, your gratitude. You call it Le Mur des Mots, the wall of words. Let's place a historical bookmark. In 1918, the Great War ends. France, like much of Europe, is scarred. Lost sons, broken cities, silence where laughter used to live. And yet through the darkest years, your dream has stood, quietly defying despair. Not with grandeur, but with grit, with detail, with the persistent, patient tap of a chisel and the trust that beauty still matters. Your palace becomes known far and wide, not officially, not yet, but through whispers. A curious legend, the postman who built a dream with his bare hands. Artists arrive with cameras, writers with notebooks, a few skeptics too, of course. They leave humbled, usually. And now for a fringe tidbit. One visitor insists that sleeping inside the palace cured her of nightmares. She claims the walls breathe calm. You politely decline her offer to market the energy. But you do start sleeping in one of the towers occasionally, wrapped in a blanket with a carved gargoyle watching from above.
Historians still argue whether the ideal palace can be classified as architecture at all. Some see it as sculpture. Others say it's environmental art. A few argue it is none of these things, that it lives outside categories the way dreams do. One scholar calls it resistance to the expected. You like that one? The wall of words begins to take shape as something deeply personal. Here, you carve not just messages, but questions. Can effort be a prayer? If we forget how to imagine, do we forget how to live? Why are curves more honest than lines? Some of the inscriptions are in full sentences. Others are fragments, like someone paused mid-thought and never finished. You hope people add their own answers someday. Your daughter brings her own children now. They play hide and seek beneath the arches, run their fingers along the rough stone, ask questions you once asked yourself. Why does that tower lean? Why is the elephant so sad? What's inside that sealed room? You answer with a wink and say, that's for the palace to tell you.
And one day, a local official visits. Not just a curious traveler, but someone with a clipboard, a title, and what appears to be authority. He asks careful questions, takes photos, looks closely at the carvings, and makes a thoughtful humming sound that feels like the beginning of bureaucracy. Later, word spreads your palace may be recognized as an official monument. Protected, preserved. You're not sure how to feel. On one hand, it means others will care for it when you no longer can. On the other, you've never once asked the palace to be understood. You only ask it to be. Still, you smile politely
And you keep building, because there's always one more pebble, one more inch of wall that could use a seashell, one more carving of a bird in a hat that no one asked for but somehow fits. You now leave small tokens for the visitors, a smooth rock at the base of a bench, a carving of a handprint tucked into a tunnel, a smiley face drawn in mortar near the elephant's tail. You say nothing, but you imagine someone finding them, pausing and thinking, "Ah, he was here." And indeed, you are. Here. Always. Even in silence, the palace speaks.
Some mornings you wake before the sun, not because you must, but because the palace seems to ask for you, to be visited in the hush of blue dawn before footsteps and questions and camera clicks break the stillness. In these quiet hours, you walk barefoot across the dewy stone floor, listening to the sleepy coo of doves nestled high in the arches. It's your favorite time. The palace yawns. You smile. There are parts of it now that you can no longer reach without assistance. Your knees are stiff and your balance, well, let's just say scaffolding and you are no longer on friendly terms. But that's okay. You're learning to build low now, closer to the earth, closer to the roots of the dream. You've started embedding found objects in new ways. Buttons, bits of broken porcelain, a watch face with no hands. Someone gave you a coin from the Americas, and you nestled it into a dragon's eye. It glints when the light hits it like the palace is blinking knowingly. Let's mark the moment with a mainstream historical fact. In 1919, the Treaty of Versailles is signed. World War I ends formally, and France begins the slow, painful work of rebuilding. Monuments rise in cities to honor the dead, names etched in stone. And here, in Hauterives, another kind of monument quietly continues to grow, honoring not the lost, but the enduring spark of the individual spirit. Visitors now include young artists, wide-eyed and hopeful, who beg to apprentice under you. You politely refuse. You tell them, you don't copy someone else's dream, you chase your own. One girl asks to sit beside you as you work. She doesn't speak, just watches. When she leaves, she gives you a sketch of the camel with wings. You keep it in your coat pocket.
Now, for a fringe tidbit, you've started keeping a tiny stone journal, not on paper, on stone tablets. Each entry is a sentence or phrase etched in scratchy script on a palm-sized rock. Rain again, wall still standing, or elephant seems smug today. You hide them around the palace. Some get found, most don't. That's fine. Historians still argue whether your stone journal is part of the artwork or part of your own private ritual. Some liken it to medieval marginalia, those tiny doodles scribes would slip into the corners of manuscripts, secret jokes, quiet thoughts, human fingerprints on the edge of sacred things. The garden around the palace has changed too. Flowers bloom where cement dust once ruled. Vines crawl like curious fingers across balustrades. You once caught a squirrel perched on a statue's nose, tail twitching like applause. The wildlife seems to respect the space, almost as if they know. Your daughter begins organizing small gatherings in the garden. Poets read aloud. Musicians strum guitars beneath stone colonnades. No one plugs anything in. It's all gentle, acoustic, shared. You sit at the edge of these gatherings, smiling faintly, not quite part of it, not quite separate. And one night, after the guests have gone and the last note of music has faded, you stay out a little longer. The moon is high. The palace glows like bone under candlelight. You place your hand against a wall, one you built decades ago, back when your mustache was black and your knuckles unscarred. It feels warm, alive. The next morning, a child visiting from Paris tugs your sleeve and asks, "Did the angels help you make this?" You crouch stiffly and say, "No, but I think they watched."
The child nods, accepts it, runs off toward the tower with a crooked smile. The palace has become a kind of storybook, open to interpretation. Each person sees something different, a poem, a prayer, a puzzle, and that's how you like it. You never wanted to tell people what to feel. You only hoped they would feel something. A local carpenter offers to repair one of your cracked balustrades. You decline, not because it's unfixable, but because the crack belongs. It's honest, like a laugh line. You start spending your evenings carving a series of faces along the base of a newly added wall, some smiling, some grim, one with a long tongue sticking out. They're not portraits, they're moods. You call it la galerie d'humeur, the gallery of moods. You hope someone finds their own face in it one day. And tucked beneath one of those carved expressions, you inscribe, "Even stone can hold a sense of humor," which, you think, just about sums everything up.
You've begun to move slower, not just physically, but in spirit. Every action, every gesture feels deliberate now. You no longer rush to finish a wall or set a stone before the sun disappears. Instead, you linger. You sit with the materials. You hold a pebble in your palm like it's a tiny relic of some forgotten truth. The palace has taught you to savor time, not conquer it. Visitors often comment on the stillness of the place. Not silence, there's always birdsong, the hush of wind, a distant child's laugh, but a stillness of intention. Like every curve, crack, and carved word was placed with the exact care a heartbeat deserves. You nod when they say this. You don't say much anymore. You've let the palace do the talking. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In the early 1920s, the world shifts into a new rhythm. France begins to modernize in earnest. Jazz drifts in from America. Electricity spreads. The car becomes less a novelty and more a necessity. Roads are paved, towns are rewired, but not you, not here. In your corner of Hauterives, you still build by hand, by instinct, by stubborn magic. And now for a fringe tidbit. A troupe of silent clowns visits one afternoon. Real clowns. Painted faces, delicate shoes, graceful pantomimes. They walk the palace with exaggerated awe, bowing to gargoyles, mimicking the expressions of your carved faces. They leave behind a tiny red ball, perfectly round, placed on the nose of your stone deer. You leave it there for weeks. Historians still debate whether your work reflects a kind of spiritualism. The swirling shapes, the temple-like corners, the references to ancient worlds and invented heavens. Some compare your palace to sacred structures in India, Cambodia, even Mesopotamia. It's a universal temple, one architect says. It's a mosaic of the human longing for something higher. You just say, it's a letter to everything I love. You've begun carving entire poems into walls now. Short verses that come to you while you sleep. You wake up, grab your chisel, and write them directly into the stone before they disappear. One reads, Night folds into morning, and still the dream builds itself. Who am I to stop? If I vanish, let this remain, a whisper you can walk through. Your daughter has taken to photographing these verses. She's begun preserving them in a notebook she calls Papa's Poems. You protest lightly. She ignores you with a smirk that echoes your own. The palace is no longer yours alone, and that's okay. Some days you don't build at all. You just sit beneath the archway you call le sourire céleste, the heavenly smile, and watch the visitors. Watch how they move through it, how they slow down, how they forget to check their watches. A man once walked in tapping nervously on a newspaper. He walked out an hour later without even noticing he dropped it. You begin seeing the palace as something alive, not just with people, but with time. It absorbs the weather, responds to footsteps, learns, adapts. Cracks in its walls become veins. Moss creeps in like age lines. And still it stands, not despite change, but because of it.
And one afternoon, after a gentle rain, you find a small bird's nest tucked into a crevice of your elephant's ear. 2 eggs inside, fragile, perfect. You crouch, smile, whisper, "Good choice." You leave it undisturbed. Now for one more stone. You've been saving this one. It's round, pinkish gray, unusually smooth. You picked it up on a delivery route years ago and kept it in your pocket for weeks, unsure where it belonged. Today, you know. You place it high, just above an arch that frames the rising sun each morning. You press it into wet mortar and whisper, "Welcome home." Then you step back, dust off your hands, look up, and nod. Because even now, even as your bones creak and your breath shortens and your world shrinks to a manageable radius, you still believe. Still believe in beauty, in patience, in the power of one pebble placed just right. And the palace? It believes in you too. By now, the palace has its own weather. You notice it one morning, how the air inside the archways is cooler than the outside breeze, how the light filters through carved columns like sunlight caught in stained glass. The walls echo sound just enough to give each footstep a sense of ceremony. When birds chirp in the courtyard, it feels like a cathedral in spring. You didn't build it this way on purpose, or maybe you did, just not with blueprints, with instinct, with feel, with that strange sense you've had for years now, that the palace knows what it wants to be, and you're just helping it remember. Visitors continue to arrive. They no longer knock. They simply enter with reverence, as if stepping into a place that transcends tickets or tours. Some cry, some laugh, some just sit. You rarely speak to them now, but when you do, it's gentle. You say things like, "The camel's in a better mood today," or "That tower leans because it's listening." They nod, not because they understand, but because they want to. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1924, the Olympic Games returned to Paris. France celebrates resilience, strength, and national pride. And yet, far from the roar of stadiums and flags waving in choreographed parades, you continue your quiet work. Your victories are smaller, stranger. A stair that didn't collapse, a pigeon that nested in your angel's palm, a crack that settled instead of spreading. And here's a fringe tidbit. One visitor swears she saw a carved face in your gallery of moods wink at her. She leaves a single peppermint at its base as a peace offering. You never see it again. The next day, a cat is sleeping there. You've started adding carved hands to the walls. Just hands. Open, closed, reaching, holding. One appears to be waving. Another cradles a tiny bird. You call them greetings. Messages without words. Gestures without names. You place them at entrances, turns, dead ends. Some people high-five them on instinct. Historians still argue whether these final editions were symbolic of something deeper. Your letting go, your farewell, your passing of the torch to unseen builders of the future. Or were you simply adding what felt right? Your daughter suggests documenting everything now. The full layout, measurements, photographs, just in case. You nod. Let her do it. But secretly, you like the idea that parts of the palace might never be fully known. That some corners will always whisper instead of speak. You begin to spend more time in one particular spot. A small bench you built facing the east tower. From there, you can see the light change across the facade. Watch the pigeons. Listen to the murmurs of visitors and wind. It becomes your perch, your thinking place, your confessional. One morning, a child hands you a smooth white rock and says, "Add this." You do, without question. You place it at the base of a carved bear, and right beneath it, "Gift from a traveler of 6 summers." And it stays there. Always will. The palace is now being talked about beyond Hauterives. Articles appear in newspapers. A famous artist sends a letter of admiration. Someone from Paris writes asking if your work will ever be replicated. You chuckle. You write back one sentence.
I build what dreams cannot repeat. You've begun thinking more about the end, not with dread, but with a kind of peace. You know you won't finish everything. Some arches will remain open, some carvings half-formed, but that's the point. Perfection was never the goal. Wonder was. And wonder doesn't end. Now, on soft afternoons, you sit with a warm drink and run your fingers over the stone textures. Each bump, groove, and grain is a syllable in your story. You can feel the decades in them, like Braille for the soul. The palace doesn't need more, but it's always happy to receive. So you keep going. Not because you must, but because you can. Somewhere along the way, the line between the palace and the landscape disappears. Vines climb your oldest columns now, winding up like patient leafy pilgrims. Moss pads the shaded alcoves. Ferns nestle themselves in the crevices between carved beasts and staircases. What was once stone has become something softened by time, by rain, by wind, by love. The garden no longer surrounds the palace. It weaves through it. You find yourself smiling more, not just at the palace, but at the people who wander through it. A couple comes back every year on their anniversary. A group of school children draws chalk outlines of your statues and names them things like Sir Turtleberry and Dame Flemingonia. You let them. The palace doesn't mind. One day, a violinist shows up and begins to play beneath your oldest arch. No introduction, no agenda, just music. You stop what you're doing, some minor mortar touch-up, and listen. The notes curl up the tower walls, spin gently through the air, and settle into the cracks like they've always belonged. You close your eyes and let the song finish before you speak. All it needs now is a stone that sings. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh flies solo across the Atlantic, changing the course of aviation.
Humanity looks to the skies, reaching farther than ever. And yet here, in your quiet courtyard of carved giraffes and Povak inscriptions, you continue reaching inward, exploring depth rather than altitude. While others chart new continents, you've mapped an entire dream within the space of a postman's garden.
And now for a fringe tidbit. A visitor once buried a time capsule somewhere in the palace, unannounced. No one knows where it is or what it contains. Some claim it's filled with letters. Others say a small harmonica. You secretly hope it's a poem. Historians still debate whether your palace should be classified among France's great monuments, or whether its value lies in its resistance to grandeur. One art critic writes, "This is not a palace of kings, but a sanctuary for everyone else." That one makes you tear up. You tape it inside your toolbox. Lately, you've taken to walking the palace with a small brush, just brushing dust from carvings, clearing spider webs, cleaning the engraved lines of your oldest scripts. It's a tender ritual, like talking in a sleeping child. You whisper little things as you do it. Still here. You're holding up well. Did you miss me? The palace, as always, says nothing. And yet, you always feel answered. You've carved another hand near the lizard in boots. This one's pointing toward the sky, index finger extended. You carve a tiny spiral into the fingertip, like it's directing thought itself. Beneath it, a line. The impossible is only a path waiting for shoes. Visitors leave small coins on the palm. You never touch them. Your daughter brings a tape recorder one day and asks you to describe your favorite part of the palace. You think for a long time, then say, "I don't know if I have a favorite part. I like the bits no one notices." She smiles and records that too. A traveling poet arrives and offers to write a book about you. You say you'd rather he write a book for the palace. He returns a year later with a worn notebook full of verses. You dedicate a new niche for it and build a shelf in the wall where no shelf should be. He places the notebook there like a sacred text. Later, a group of monks visits and reads the poems aloud at sunset. You do nothing. Just listen. Just breathe. You've begun shaping tiny figures in the walls, barely more than silhouettes. Dancing people, a fox mid-leap, a man holding a kite. You place them at ankle height where only the observant notice. A child spots one and calls it a secret parade. You grin. That's exactly right. One morning, you wake to find the air crisp and sharp. Autumn again. The trees beyond the palace are on fire with color. You wrap yourself in a thick scarf, grab your brush and your small trowel, and make your way to the far western wall. There's a single empty space there, just large enough for one more carving. You don't know what it will be yet, but the palace does. So you wait. The blank space on the western wall becomes a quiet obsession. Each morning you stand before it, brush in hand, tools tucked under one arm, staring at that bare patch of stone as if waiting for it to speak. Sometimes you even ask out loud, "Well, any ideas yet?" The wind rustles through the ivy. A bird chirps in reply, but no answer comes. Not yet. And so you tend to other things. There's always something. Mortar that's cracked from a winter freeze, moss to coax from the mouths of the laughing lions, a carved stair that's grown slick with age and needs a gentle scrubbing. You move slower now, but with the careful confidence of someone who knows this place by heart. Every step you take is familiar. Every curve of stone remembers your hands. Let's pause here for a mainstream historical fact. In 1930, the world is shifting again. Economic collapse ripples across borders. In France, times are hard. Money is short. Spirits are frayed. But in Hauterives, tucked behind a modest house
The ideal palace continues its strange, slow rhythm. Free to enter, free to wonder, free to believe in something handmade and improbable. People seem to need it more now. They arrive tired, anxious, hungry, not just for food, but for meaning. Some bring bread to share, others bring stories. A few simply bring themselves, quiet and wide-eyed, content to just be in the space. You welcome them all.
And here's a fringe tidbit. A traveling magician visits once and performs a card trick beneath the giraffe spire. He pulls a coin from behind your ear. You laugh, deep and unexpected. You hadn't heard your own laughter in weeks. When he leaves, he places a card, a queen of hearts, into a carved lion's mouth. It's still there. Historians still argue about the timeline now. They try to pinpoint when the masterpiece was complete. Some date it to your final spire, others say it was when you etched your last poem into the wall, but they miss the truth entirely. It was never about being done. It was always about doing. That blank space on the western wall lingers. You stop expecting it to tell you what it wants. Instead, you begin telling it stories. As you sweep the floor or mix lime or brush dust from the temple gate, you talk aloud. Maybe you're a window, or a door no one opens, or just space for someone else's dream. One evening, as the sky blushes orange and pink, your daughter joins you on the bench facing that wall. You ask her what she sees. She squints, tilts her head, says, "I think it's waiting for a goodbye." You nod, because yes, maybe that's it.
You decide not to carve there yet. Instead, you build a tiny shelf just below the blank stone. On it, you place a round white pebble, the one given to you by a child years ago. No plaque, no label, just the pebble. And below it, in tiny script, you inscribe, "This is the end I never needed to finish." Visitors begin to leave tokens there. A ribbon, a letter, a stone shaped like a heart. It becomes a shrine, not to endings, but to pauses, to the idea that not all stories need final chapters. Some just rest. Your daughter starts calling it the listening wall. You never argue. These days, your body tires more easily. Your walks are shorter. Your chisel lies untouched for longer stretches. But still, you are here. You sit in your favorite spots, hum old songs under your breath, watch shadows crawl across the carvings as the day turns soft. The palace watches with you. It is not sad. It is simply full. You begin to sense something strange and wonderful. The palace is no longer a project. It's a memory, a living one. People now greet each other with reverence in its spaces. They read your inscriptions aloud in low voices. Children trace the outlines of carved faces with their fingers. Couples hold hands under archways. Artists still sketch. Poets still scribble. And when they leave, they look lighter somehow. Lighter than when they arrived. That, you think, is enough. More than enough.
Winter comes again, crisp and white. The palace wears it like a quiet crown, snow frosting every arch and dome, each tower gleaming like a sugar sculpture. Icicles hang like chandeliers from the mouths of lions, and birds perch along the backs of stone crocodiles, puffed up against the cold. The palace doesn't seem to mind. If anything, it looks more itself than ever, softened, aged, dignified. You shuffle along the worn paths slowly now, each step a bit more deliberate. Your breath clouds the air, and your scarf tucks beneath your chin like a woolen smile. You carry no tools today, just your brush, just a small bag of breadcrumbs for the sparrows. You sit beneath the camel spire, a favorite spot, as always. This used to be your resting place after long days of carving. Now it's simply your place, your throne of moss and stone and memory. You watch the sunlight ripple across your elephant's flanks and catch in the little glass insets of your mosaic dome. It still dazzles. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1931, the world marvels at the completion of the Empire State Building, one of the tallest structures ever made by man, piercing the sky with steel ambition. Newspapers call it a triumph of modernity. But here, in the tiny French village of Hauterives, your palace continues to grow in the opposite direction, rooted, handmade, wrapped in vines and stories and mud. A different kind of ambition. And here's a fringe tidbit. A woman visits with a guidebook full of spiritual pilgrimage sites. She says your palace radiates womb energy. You don't know what that means, but you show her the temple of nature and let her leave a flower by the fountain. She cries a little. You do not ask why. Historians still argue whether your work qualifies as naive art. The term doesn't sit quite right with your daughter. There's nothing naive about devotion, she mutters one evening, sketching the profile of your oldest statue. You agree, but say nothing. You've stopped needing to define things. The palace is what it is. That's enough. Now, people bring offerings. Not to you, to the walls. A button from a beloved coat, a drawing from a child, a dried sprig of lavender tied with ribbon. They lead them gently, reverently, in corners where birds sing or light pools or wind hums through the openings just so. And the palace accepts them. You begin carving less, but you still brush. Each morning, you trace the edges of your oldest sculptures with your worn bristles. You greet each curve like an old friend. The lion's mane, the giraffe's me, the snail-shaped tower that never quite spiraled evenly. All of them familiar. All of them yours. And you talk aloud now. Not to anyone in particular, just to the palace. You're looking sturdy today. I think the frost suits you. You remember when the goat fell off that ledge? We never found it. You laugh quietly at that one. One day, you spot a boy sitting cross-legged in the amphitheater garden, sketching with remarkable focus. You approach, watch silently over his shoulder. He's drawing your winged angel, almost perfectly, but with one change. He's added a small cat curled on her shoulder. You love it. You whisper, "That's better than mine." He smiles without turning. "She looked like she needed a friend." You nod. We all do. You stay there longer than usual, sitting beside the boy as he draws. The wind rustles the dry branches. Somewhere a visitor reads a poem aloud from your wall of words. Let time forget the date. Let memory shape the stone. That one was yours. That one still makes your chest ache, in a good way. And now, that empty space on the western wall, it's not bothering you anymore. You still visit it,
still sit in front of it sometimes, but you don't ask it for anything. It has become a kind of quiet mirror. You see yourself in it, not just now, but then. All the versions of you. The younger man with dust in his beard, the middle-aged dreamer with aching joints, the father, the builder, the wanderer who stayed put and still found a world. The wall says nothing, but it listens. And that, you've come to believe, is enough.
The days grow shorter now. Light slips into the palace like a sigh, brushing against domes and arches with a softer touch. Shadows stretch longer, lingering on carved stairways and pooling in the hollows of angel wings. You begin waking earlier, not from restlessness, but a quiet sense of responsibility, as if the palace needs you close, even if only to witness. You no longer build. Not really. The chisel sits unused, resting atop a folded cloth, just as you left it weeks ago. It doesn't feel like failure. It feels like respect. The palace doesn't ask to be finished. It only asks to be remembered. And you remember everything. Each pebble has a story. Each arch a joke you whispered to yourself while balancing on a ladder. Each statue carries a piece of your breath. You pass by the crocodile wearing a hat and chuckle again, because it still looks pleased with itself. Your fingers graze the carved owls above the pillar gate. One of them has a secret pocket behind its wing. You once hid a marble there. It's still there. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1933, Picasso unveils new surrealist works that fracture the expectations of art. Critics debate meaning and metaphor, searching for order in chaos. Meanwhile, in your patch of France, the surreal has always been welcome. Here, a temple may sit beside a cave shaped like a turtle, and no one raises an eyebrow. It's not surrealism. It's sincerity without apology.
And now for a fringe tidbit. A woman comes and whispers her wishes into the mouth of your carved snail. She says she returns every year, that it listens better than any person. One day, she brings her newborn, presses the baby's hand to the snail's shell, and says, "I wanted him to meet his first temple." You say nothing, but later you find a heart made of rose petals on the snail's back. Historians still argue about your legacy. Some claim you were a mystic, others a visionary outsider artist. A few dismiss it all as eccentric Ruran expression. But your daughter has begun writing her own account. In it, she simply says, "He loved beauty more than comfort, and built proof of it." You can't improve on that. You find comfort in rhythm now, your days following a pattern. Wake, brush, walk, sit, remember, greet the birds, accept the gifts left by strangers. A pine cone, a charm, a drawing. You feel less like the palace's creator now, and more like its caretaker, or maybe its first ghost. Some evenings you light a candle inside the dome at the center. The glass fragments you set years ago catch the flicker and throw dappled light across the walls. Visitors see the glow and call it the heart light. You let them. It fits. You talk to your wife more often now, out loud in the privacy of the palace's smaller corners. You tell her what you saw that day. A dog wearing a sweater, a boy with an origami hat, a girl who left a note that read, "I want to be brave like this." You smile and say, they would have liked you.
Your daughter begins planning for something official. Preservation efforts, a museum status. You nod your approval, gently, but ask her not to rope off the walls. Let people touch it, you say. It's made to be felt.
she promises. And in the quietest hour of the afternoon, you return again to the listening wall. The white pebble still rests there. Around it, more have gathered. Trinkets, drawings, bits of ribbon. One note simply reads, "I don't know what this is, but I needed it." You close your eyes. That's exactly right. You sit down and rest your back against the curved base of the wall. The air smells of old stone and lavender. You can hear the wind moving through the giraffe spire above, and somewhere a child giggles. The sound echoes gently, like a bell that's just been struck. You whisper, "Good." And the palace says nothing. As always. But you feel the reply just the same.
Time has begun to fold in strange ways. Some mornings you wake and forget what year it is, but the palace always reminds you. Each stone a timestamp, each curve of an arch a whisper of who you were when you placed it. There's comfort in this. While the outside world spins faster and stranger, here time flows like syrup, slow and golden. Visitors now arrive in 2s and 3s, often with old postcards of the palace in hand. Some carry yellowed newspaper clippings. A few bring their parents or grandparents who visited decades ago. They all say the same thing. It hasn't changed at all. But you know better. Everything has changed. The walls lean more, the vines are thicker, the laughter is softer, and you are slower, smaller, more inward. But the place holds you, shapes itself around you like a favorite coat worn perfectly to your form. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1936, France establishes paid vacation leave for workers. Families begin traveling for leisure. It's a small revolution of rest, of claiming time for beauty and joy. And some of those travelers come here, to a dream carved by a former postman. You see it in their eyes. They expect a curiosity. They find peace. And here's a fringe tidbit. Someone leaves behind a carved spoon. Just a spoon. Handmade, rough, lovely. You find it tucked into the crook of a lion's paw. You leave it there. Over the next weeks, other spoons appear. Painted, whittled, one carved from soap. It becomes a quiet joke. La collection de cuillères. You build a little shelf to honor it. Historians still argue whether these offerings are acts of reverence or rebellion, a rejection of museum sterility in favor of something more alive. One scholar calls it interactive folk mythology. Another just says it's France's only open-source cathedral. You chuckle at that one. You walk the palace as you always have, but now with pauses, more frequent rests. The bench beneath the turtle dome becomes your station. From there, you can see 3 towers, 5 faces, and the edge of the listening wall. You begin to count the birds. Pigeons, finches, once even a stork. They seem to know the safest ledges. You imagine they've named them, like little neighborhoods in a feathered city. Today I'm roosting in Angel Row. The listening wall grows. You never ask people to leave things, but they do. Paper cranes, painted stones, a pair of worn ballet slippers. One letter, written in careful child's handwriting, says, "I built a sandcastle and thought of you." You wipe your eyes after that one. Your daughter has taken to reading you the guest book entries. She keeps a notebook now, writes down the things people say as they leave. Here are a few. "I thought I came for architecture. I found poetry. My grief eased here.
You remind me of what's possible with time and tea.
Some people have started calling you le bâtisseur invisible, the invisible builder. You don't mind. It fits. You've become part of the walls now. The place breathes with your rhythm, even when you're asleep. And some days, you are tired. Very tired. But you do not resist it. The palace is built to hold weariness gently. You sit with your daughter and drink warm broth in the evenings. She asks you things about stones, about joints, about lime and sand, and how to hold a chisel so it doesn't slip. She carves her first tiny spiral into a column near the front gate. You don't correct her. It's a little crooked, which means it belongs. You still brush every day. That small, steady movement. Brush, brush, whisper, breathe. It's no longer maintenance. It's meditation. And you visit one final corner, one few ever see, a hidden recess behind the snail tower. In it, you've carved a single sentence. I stayed because the dream was kind. No one knows it's there, except you and the palace.
A soft hush has settled over everything. It's not silence exactly. There are still birds, footsteps, whispers, but the noise has lost its edges. Sounds feel like memories now, half faded and warm around the edges. You notice it as you sit on the moss-covered bench, looking out toward the western wall. The world feels like wrapped in cotton. You're not sure if it's the season, your age, or the way light moves differently through the palace lately. But it feels right. Visitors continue to arrive, though they speak even more quietly now, as if the palace has trained them. A woman walks barefoot through the corridors and says the stones feel like they're listening. A boy ties a red thread between two columns and calls it a wish bridge. You leave it up. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1937, the World's Fair in Paris opens, showcasing the modern achievements of industry and progress. But not far away, in a tiny village, not even on most maps, your handmade universe continues to whisper its quiet defiance. No electricity, no steel, no architects, just stone, patience, and poetry. And here's a fringe tidbit. A man from Japan sends a small wooden dragon, carved with care and painted red. He writes, "This reminds me of your lion. I thought it should have a friend." You give it a home above the eastern gate, where it sits like it was always meant to be there. Historians still argue whether this structure is art or architecture or madness. One philosopher writes, "It is the opposite of ruin. It is the preservation of longing." Your daughter reads you that quote aloud one evening, and you ask her to read it again. She does. Twice.
You begin sleeping more. Not in bed always, but wherever the light is softest. Sometimes in the amphitheater. Sometimes beneath the dome of the temple of nature, wrapped in your old coat. You sleep like the palace sleeps, in sections, with one ear still open to birdsong. There's less work to do now, but you still find things. A cracked step to sweep, a loose pebble to tuck back in place, a whisper to give the walls. One morning, a man with a gentle voice says, "It feels like your palace is dreaming." You nod and reply, "I think it always has been." You mean it. The listening wall has grown into something you no longer understand, but it comforts you. Every offering becomes part of the story. You stop reading the messages. You just sit near them,
Let them hum in the air like lullabies in languages you don't need to know. You begin carving less, but drawing more. Small sketches on scraps of paper, unfinished ideas, new arches, silly animals. You give them to your daughter. She keeps them in a box labeled Papa's Maybes. You visit the same 5 spots each day like prayer beads.
The giraffe spire, still slightly crooked, still proud. The angel's bench, where a single white feather always seems to appear. The dome of colors, your mosaic gem. The turtle fountain, slow and joyful. And the listening wall. Always the listening wall. One day, you leave your own note there. You don't write much, just 4 words in shaky script. Thank you for waiting. That night, the wind stirs stronger than usual, rattling branches and tugging at scarves and shutters. But the palace holds. Of course it does. It was never built to fall.
It's a warm morning when your daughter finds you in the garden. You're sitting beneath the mosaic dome, a wool blanket draped over your shoulders, a half-finished sketch of a smiling bird resting in your lap. You're awake, just resting, eyes half closed, face turned up toward the colored light pooling through your favorite glasswork. The kind of peaceful stillness that seems to blend a person into the stone around them. She doesn't speak at first, just watches. You smile when you hear her steps. "You missed the sunrise," she says softly. "No," I reply. "I was inside it." And in a way, you were. The palace seems more alive than usual, as if it senses something shifting. The breeze is gentle but constant. The birds are especially chatty. The carved hands on the eastern wall catch the sun like they're waving goodbye, or maybe welcoming something. Everything here moves at its own pace. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1939, the world begins to fray. War looms. Tensions rise. Across Europe, fear coils tighter and tighter. But in Hauterives, the ideal palace stands unchanged. Its turrets unaware of borders, its arches untouched by headlines. It continues to offer refuge, however quietly, to anyone who seeks it.
And here's a fringe tidbit. That morning, someone leaves a snow globe at the base of the camel tower. Inside is a tiny, glitter-dusted version of the palace itself, complete with a giraffe, a lion, and a single flying bird. You chuckle when you shake it. Didn't expect to be immortalized in plastic, but you keep it. Place it on a ledge near the front gate. Visitors come and go, as always, but their voices are gentler, their steps slower. One woman lingers by the temple gate and whispers to your daughter, "I don't know why, but I feel like this place is saying goodbye." She nods, but says nothing. You take fewer steps now. The path between your home and the central dome is enough. You sit, you breathe, you brush the same stretch of stone you've brushed for years. Your daughter joins you more often. She reads to you sometimes. Guestbook entries, poems, newspaper clippings. One from a journalist in Paris reads, "In an age of instant construction and disposable wonder, the postman's palace stands not just as a monument, but as a counterspell, a place where time slows and the human hand is sacred again." You smile. He got it right. You begin humming more often. Little tunes from childhood. Marches you used to whistle on your mail route. A lullaby your wife used to hum while washing your shirts. Your daughter begins humming them too. The palace echoes them faintly. Stone makes a fine memory box for music.
Your hands are weaker now. The brush is lighter, but you still sweep the dust, still trace the same carved lines. You run your fingers over the phrase etched near the turtle. Let the world rush past, I'll stay here. And you believe it more than ever. A boy leaves a single feather tied to a string hanging from a ledge. It sways in the breeze and makes the dome sing, just slightly, just enough. You call it the palace's breath. He grins when you tell him. And the listening wall? It has become a garden of its own. New pebbles, paper cranes, coins, ribbons, even a violin string coiled like a sleeping snake. Your note is still there, thank you for waiting, but others now curl around it like roots of affection growing from your words. One woman kneels by it, closes her eyes, and says, "This feels like the last chapter of a very gentle book." You're nearby, brushing a pillar. You nod. "I think the ending writes itself," you murmur. She leaves behind a folded map with a single route traced in red ink, labeled "To Peace." You place it gently behind a carved snail shell, a secret, folded into stone. Your daughter begins carving more now, small shapes, gentle lines. She adds tiny symbols near the faces, stars, leaves, one small spiral. She doesn't need permission. The palace has already welcomed her hands. One evening, as the sun turns everything the color of tea, you walk the full length of the palace, slowly, quietly, touching each tower, pausing at each gate, whispering something only the walls will remember. And then you sit, fold your hands, and listen. Because even now, after all these years, the palace still has stories to tell.
You wake to birdsong and breath. There's a stillness in the air, not the absence of movement, but the kind that happens when something sacred is about to shift. You feel it in your bones, in the way your hand rests softly against the blanket, in the way the light filters down through the colored glass dome, painting your knees blue and gold. You sit in your usual spot. Your daughter has already brought tea. It steams gently beside you on the stone ledge. She doesn't speak right away, just sits beside you, shoulder to shoulder. You say, "They're nesting again in the giraffe's mane." She smiles. They know where the good real estate is. The warmth between you is quiet and old and strong. Visitors arrive later in the morning, fewer today, and quieter still. You watch a man kneel by the listening wall with a guitar case slung over his shoulder. He doesn't play, he just rests his forehead against the stone and breathes deeply, as though he's exhaling a burden he forgot he was carrying. You understand that. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In early 1940, the world around you grows dark. War has begun. France braces. Fear spreads. But within the palace, the war does not echo. The arches do not tremble. The giraffe does not duck. The snail does not retreat. There is no strategy here, just stillness and the refusal to rush. And here's a fringe tidbit. Someone sends a letter addressed only to the dream carver. No return address. Inside is a drawing of a staircase wrapped in vines and a note. "I built this in my sleep. Thought you'd like to see it." You pin it to the back of your workbench. Your daughter finds it there weeks later and adds a doodle of a bird to the corner.
Historians still argue how you sustained the will to build day after day for decades. They search for clues in your childhood, your mail routes, your losses. Some write essays on compulsion. Others romanticize you into legend. But the real answer, simple and quiet, never changes. You built it because you could, and because it made the days worth waking for. At midday, a young man sets up a folding chair and reads poetry in the temple of nature. His voice is soft. His words drift through the air like silk. We do not carve from stone. We coax it. We beg it to remember who we are. You close your eyes and let the words settle inside your chest like warm stones in a shallow stream. You no longer move much, but when you do, it's with purpose. You visit the front gate and rest your palm against the turtle. You whisper, "Keep walking." Then the giraffe, "Hold your head high." Then the lion, "Stay fierce." You smile at that last one. The lion always looks slightly smug anyway. And then you go to the listening wall. Your daughter is already there. She's sweeping gently with your old brush, now more wood than bristle. She's added a few small carvings, new hands, open and overlapping, reaching toward the center where your pebble still sits. She doesn't look up when she speaks. They keep coming. They keep leaving pieces. You nod. One new note, folded into a paper fox, says, "When I had no one else to talk to, I talked here." Another, "I told the palace I was scared. It didn't tell me I shouldn't be." Another, in perfect cursive, "Thank you for building something that didn't ask me to be anything but tired." You take a long, quiet breath. And for the first time in days, you feel the ache lift from your back. Not vanish, just rise slightly, enough to let you sit taller, enough to let you look around. The palace is glowing, not with light necessarily, but with presence, like a friend leaning close, saying nothing, but staying. You murmur, "I think it's done." Your daughter doesn't answer. She just reaches over and places her hand in yours. Later, as the sun droops toward the hills, someone begins playing a violin under the dome. It's the same man who once played years ago, you think, or perhaps a son. The melody is unfamiliar, but kind. It drapes itself across the palace like a shawl. You lean back and close your eyes. You do not sleep, but you dream. And the palace dreams with you.
The days stretch thinner now, like gold leaf laid over the edges of memory. You spend more time wrapped in quiet. Not loneliness, no, not that, but solitude, softened by age and by stone. The palace knows when to keep you company and when to give you space. It's grown wise, like its builder. Today you remain indoors longer than usual, sipping broth your daughter made, tracing the rim of the bowl with your finger. Outside, you hear soft voices and laughter, a child squealing as they discover the elephant arch, a parent shushing gently. It doesn't interrupt your peace. It deepens it. The palace is holding them, too. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1941, the world is at war. Paris is occupied. Fear becomes a second language. But even as headlines scream and nations tremble, your ideal palace holds to its own calendar of spring and vines and small kindnesses. People still come, not for spectacle, but for shelter, even if only in spirit. And now, for a fringe tidbit, a baker from Lyon brings a cake shaped like the temple of nature. He places it gently beneath the camel statue, wrapped in linen. A note says, "For the one who baked in stone." You let the children share it. You don't care much for sweets these days, but you eat one corner with frosting that tastes like lemon and old happiness. Historians still argue whether your work is architectural genius or just eccentric folk art. They hold symposiums, they publish treatises, but your daughter tells them all the same thing when they visit. You're missing it. You have to feel it. Then she leads them to the listening wall and leaves them there.
Today, a letter arrives, carried by a girl who walks barefoot even in winter. She says it's from her grandmother. Inside is a poem. Quote, "He carved not from ambition, but because the silence needed shape." Unquote. Claire L., 1924 to now. You keep it near you. Tuck it into the folds of your blanket. It hums like something you meant to write yourself. The listening wall now curves slightly, not from design, but from use. Its base has been polished smooth by knees and fingertips. A gentle hollow has formed in the shape of a leaning head. No one planned it. It just happened. That's how you know it's good. A child leaves a plush rabbit on the stone. It has no note, but someone else places a tiny scarf around its neck later that day. The palace smiles without moving. You no longer make new things, but sometimes you bless the old ones. A whisper here, a kiss to a handprint. You find a new crack in the tower, place your palm on it and say, "You've held so much, it's okay to shift." Your daughter begins carving a sentence above the listening wall. You ask what it will say. She replies something like what you would say, and you trust her. You take shorter walks. The full circuit of the palace becomes a 2-day affair, but each corner still greets you like an old friend. Even the cracks, even the places where rain has worn your detail away. It doesn't feel like loss, it feels like memory softening the edges. You dream more now. Not of cities or mail routes or even the people you've known. You dream of stones rearranging themselves, of moss spelling secret messages, of statues whispering to one another once night falls. You wake laughing sometimes. Your daughter records those dreams in a little blue book. One entry reads, "He says the giraffe learned to wink." Another, "He dreamt a door opened in the back of the snail, and inside was a music box playing the sound of falling leaves." You begin sitting at the entrance each evening, watching the last visitor leave. You wave. They always wave back. It's enough. It's everything. You spend the morning tracing sunlight. It filters through the palace like a slow exhale, pouring over columns, curling around arches, stretching thin fingers across your lap. You follow it with your eyes as it slides up the lion's flank, lingers on the giraffe's ear, then kisses the edge of the listening wall before disappearing behind the snail tower. You murmur, "You're learning the route well." The palace doesn't answer, but then again, it never has to. Your daughter joins you with warm tea. She wraps a second shawl around your shoulders and sits close, not speaking. You both know there's no need. The quiet has grown thick, rich with everything already said. The path from your bench to the gate feels longer now. Each step a meditation. You move like you're underwater, slow, deliberate, weightless, but you still move. The palace is watching, and you never want it to worry. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1943, a French resistance network hides messages in loaves of bread, bicycles, even laundry lines. Ordinary things made extraordinary. That's always been your language, turning what's overlooked into something sacred. The palace was your resistance, not against an army, but against forgetting. And here's a fringe tidbit. Someone leaves behind a seashell filled with lavender. No note, just the scent. You place it in the temple of nature, where the wind can stir it gently. Visitors comment on it for weeks. What is that smell? They ask. Peace, you'll reply.
Historians still argue about that smell. One calls it olfactory memory design. Another claims it was purely symbolic. But a child presses their face to the stone and says, "It smells like Grandma's hugs." And that settles it. You rest more often beneath the dome now. Bundled in blankets, your daughter is quilted from old clothes. She's embroidered tiny spirals into the corners. One has your name stitched inside a heart. You tease her. "Getting sentimental?" She replies, "I'm just labeling my best rock." The visitors have taken on a reverent tone. They move like pilgrims, like guests at a cathedral with no priest. Some bring music boxes, others hum. Many bring nothing at all, which somehow feels like the most appropriate offering. A man sits beside you and reads from your wall of poetry. He stumbles on the line, "What if the journey ends before the dream does?" You pat him arm and say, "Then the dream walks on without you." And it will. The listening wall continues to bloom, not with plants, but with stories. A drawing of two foxes curled together, a note in braille affixed gently with twine, a ribbon woven through the hands your daughter carved, a single coin from a far-off country polished smooth by decades of worry.
Your daughter keeps sketching new plans, small additions, gentle restorations. You give your blessing. The palace isn't done, just paused, like a sentence that ends with an ellipsis instead of a period. One morning, she shows you something carved just above the snail tower, a simple sentence, newly etched. "Papa slept here." You laugh. Not very poetic. She grins. "I'm saving the poetry for the next wall." You feel a weight in your chest. Not pain, not sadness, just fullness. Like the palace has climbed inside you and taken root. Or maybe you've sunk into it so deeply that you can no longer be separated. You are limestone and lichen, mosaic and mortar. You are home. The sun sets slowly. The birds grow quiet. The wind moves gently through the carved corridors, humming through tiny openings like an invisible flute. It's music made by absence, by air given shape. You close your eyes. You dream of stones dancing. This morning, everything feels wrapped in velvet. The air is soft. The breeze is gentler than usual. Even the birds seem to sing in minor keys, quieter melodies that settle in the arches like feathered lullabies. You wake slowly, not startled but coaxed, like a candle being asked to flicker back to life one more time. You are still in your usual chair beneath the dome. The colors on the walls shift with the rising sun. You let the light wash over your hands, which lie folded in your lap like old maps, creased, worn, but full of destinations. Your daughter arrives with warm water and a slice of bread. You don't eat much anymore, but you take the bread, tear it into small pieces, and toss them toward the birds perched along the camel's back. They swoop down with practiced confidence.
You've trained them, she says, sitting beside you. No, you murmur. They've trained me. You both smile. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1945, the war finally ends. France breathes. Cities rebuild. Graves are counted. And across it all, people rediscover a need for quiet places. Pilgrims of peace. Many come here, not to be dazzled, but to be softened, to remember that hope can be hand-carved. And here's a fringe tidbit. A traveler from Brazil brings a stone from his grandmother's garden. He says, "She taught me how to plant things that bloom late." You nod. He places the stone in your hand and adds, "This belongs in your garden." You place it in the listening wall. It fits perfectly.
Historians still argue if this palace is a monument or a message, if it belongs to architecture or folklore, if it should be protected or left to weather naturally. You have no opinions on this. You only know what it feels like to wake beneath its shadow, wrapped in light. There are fewer visitors today. A blessing. The ones who do come lingered longer. They sit without speaking. One man spends nearly an hour beside the turtle, carving a tiny songbird from soap. He doesn't leave it behind, just shows it to you, places it in your hand for a moment, then tucks it back into his pocket. You say, "It'll sing better in your home." He nods, but it was born here. You take a slow walk to the eastern wall. The route has become ritual. Past the cracked pillar, around the mosaic lizard, through the gate of faces. You know every dip in the path, every step that creaks like an old floorboard. Your daughter steadies you. You let her. You reach the listening wall. Someone has chalked a spiral above your white pebble, with the word stillness written inside. You touch it. The chalk dust clings to your fingers. You whisper, "Stillness is not stopping." And for a moment you hear the palace breathe, not with sound, but with presence, with warmth, with memory pressing gently against your skin like a blanket you didn't know you needed. You sit, you watch, you listen. The sun moves slowly. Time unwinds. The lines on the walls blur into one another, like stories being retold by firelight. A tower hums softly in the wind. Your daughter's brush makes a shh sound as she sweeps a new layer of dust from a carved owl's wing. She hums, and you recognize the tune. It's the lullaby your wife once sang, about fields and feathers and finding home. You close your eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. You remember everything. The long roads, the heavy mailbag, the first stone, the first ache in your hands, the second, the hundreds, the way the walls leaned towards you as you worked, like they were helping, the way the rain never truly washed anything away, the way the snails always returned, the way children stared up in silence, and you could hear their wonder forming shapes. You remember joy, and you remember choosing this, not once, but every day. The palace does not say goodbye, it simply stays.
The world has grown hushed. You feel it in your bones, which now seem more like branches, brittle, wise, and shaped by the seasons. The palace echoes your rhythm, each stone settling a little deeper into the earth, each archway breathing a little slower, you and it resting together. This morning, you wake before the sun. The air smells like dew and earth, with a faint trace of lavender from the seashell by the temple of nature. Your daughter finds you already sitting, wrapped in your shawl, watching the horizon blur from blue to gold. "You're up early," she says. "I never really went to sleep," you reply. She doesn't ask more. The birds begin their morning rustle. A single pigeon coos from the lion's back. The giraffe creaks slightly in the wind. Everything speaks gently. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1950, France begins rebuilding its cultural legacy. Monuments are restored, museums reopen, and still your ideal palace stands, not as a relic, but as a living memory. No velvet ropes, no tickets, just open gates and open hands. And here's a fringe tidbit. A boy brings a stone painted like a ladybug. He leaves it near your mosaic dome and writes, "She'll guard the dreams while you rest." You nod to no one in particular. You believe him. Historians still argue whether your work was divinely inspired or born from stubborn daydreaming. One modern critic calls it an accidental theology. Your daughter, when asked about it, only shrugs and says he loved rocks and his wife. That's enough.
It is. You make your way to the listening wall one last time. You stop, often, not from pain, but from reverence. Each step feels like a note in a farewell melody. At the Turtle Dome, you whisper, "Steady." At the Angel Gate, you say, "Shine." At the Lion's Paw, roar softly. When you arrive, the wall has changed again. Someone has woven wildflowers through the cracks. Someone else placed a mirror beneath your pebble, catching the sky above it. Another folded a note into a perfect paper heart, left beneath a small dome of glass. You don't read them anymore. You just let them be. You sit for a long time. Your daughter joins you with a thermos of warm broth. She doesn't ask you to eat. She just hands it to you, places your brush in your lap, and rests her head on your shoulder. The wind picks up slightly, and from somewhere deep inside the palace, there's a low musical hum. Not quite a song, not quite a whisper, just enough to remind you that the walls are listening always. You turn to your daughter and say, "When I'm gone, don't make it perfect." She nods. "I promise. No velvet ropes." No ropes. And let the kids climb the turtle. She smiles. They already do. That makes you laugh. A real one. It echoes a little in the dome. The palace catches it and holds it. The last of the sunlight touches your hands. You raise your brush, trembling slightly, and sweep one slow stroke across the same spot you've brushed every day for years. The stone there is smoother than any other, worn down by care. You whisper, "That'll do." And then you rest your hand in your daughter's. The air settles. A dove lands above the listening wall and coos once. You close your eyes, not in farewell, but in arrival. The palace exhales, and so do you. The sky today is the color of old paper, pale, soft, creased with clouds. Your daughter walks the palace alone this morning. She doesn't hurry. Her steps follow paths worn into the earth by decades of your routine. She pauses at the mosaic dome where your blanket still rests folded on the bench. She carries the brush in one hand and a bundle of fresh wildflowers in the other. She begins the day as you always did, with a whisper. "Morning, Papa." The palace does not answer in words, but it holds her gaze a little longer, casts its shadow a little warmer, lets the breeze move through it like a sigh. It remembers. Visitors began arriving quietly. Word has spread. Not of your passing, no one says that. They just say, he's part of the stone now. And that feels right. No mourning shrouds, no closed gates, just quiet steps, soft hands, and long looks at everything you left behind. Let's pause for a mainstream historical fact. In 1969, 20 years after your death, the French government officially declares the Ideal Palace a cultural landmark. Too late for you to hear it, of course, but perfect in its own way. You never built it for titles. Still, there's something poetic about a postman's dream outlasting ministers and mayors.
And here's a fringe tidbit. Someone leaves a small hourglass filled with salt instead of sand. No note, just the object, placed gently beneath the camel tower. Visitors flip it throughout the day. They say it tells time differently. You'd approve. Historians still argue, of course. They try to chart your lines, decode your symbols, track your references to sacred geometry and esoteric texts. They always miss the most important truth. You built not from books, but from longing. Not for recognition, but for stillness. Your daughter doesn't argue with them. She just builds. A new wall is forming behind the temple of nature. Smaller, softer, curved like a hug. It's filled with spirals, stars, and a single giraffe the size of a cat. She calls it the listening wall's sister. Children have already started adding things: beads, shells, tiny painted suns. And every evening, she walks the route. Turtle dome, giraffe arch, mosaic bench, listening wall. She brushes the same patch you did, not because it's dusty, but because it keeps your rhythm alive. A boy asks her, "Do you miss him?" She replies, "No, he's still brushing." And perhaps he is. Perhaps your hand is in the vines that curl along the angel's gate. Perhaps your breath is the wind inside the shell. Perhaps every pebble now has a little bit of your heartbeat folded inside. And the palace? It stands, not as a monument, but as a lullaby in stone. A story written in the language of tired hands and quiet wonder. And for those who arrive aching or grieving or lost, there is still a bench to rest on. Still a tower that leans just a little. Still a snail that glows at sunset. Still a wall that listens. The dream has not ended. It has simply changed narrators. And now, as our journey draws to a close, let everything soften. Let your hands grow still. Let your thoughts stretch out like lazy shadows at dusk. The palace rests now, deep in the heart of France, its stones warm from the sun, and its stories curled like sleeping cats in every crevice. It doesn't shout for attention. It never did. It hums. It waits. It listens. You don't have to remember every tower, every lion, every snail shell tucked into its folds. You only need to remember how it made you feel. Still, safe, slow. Imagine lying on the mosaic floor, your back against the cooled stone, eyes half closed, listening to the wind move through the arches like the rustle of linen sheets. Somewhere nearby,
A child's laughter rises, soft and echoing like water in a distant fountain. The smell of lavender drifts in again. Someone hums the lullaby from long ago. You breathe. You drift. The dream holds you gently, not demanding anything, not asking you to wake. You are inside the story now. You are part of the walls. And in this quiet, this hush, this final stillness, you are home. Sleep well. Sweet dreams.